He slammed his fist on the crate so hard the wood cracked beneath her feet. $20! Harlan Price screamed at the crowd, his face the color of old blood, his breath a cloud of whiskey and rot in the freezing air. $20 for the woman and the brat both. Someone's got to take 'em off my hands tonight, or I swear I'll leave 'em in the snow. Elwyn Price stood on that crate with Toby pressed against her chest, her 7-month-old son, who had no idea what was happening, who was simply cold and hungry, and reaching one tiny fist up toward her face, and she did not cry. She had learned long ago that crying in front of Harlan only made things worse. But her legs were shaking, and every man in that crowd was looking at her like she was livestock. If you've ever stood somewhere and realized, with cold certainty, that your life could end in the next 10 minutes, not from sickness, not from accident, but because another human being decided you weren't worth keeping, then you already know exactly what Elwyn felt standing on that crate in the dying settlement of Rattlesnake Hollow on the worst night of her life. If that were you up there, if that were your child in your arms, what would you do? Stay with us, because what happened next on that mountain changed everything, and you will not want to miss a single moment of it. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, please subscribe to our channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss the stories we bring you. Drop a comment below and tell us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if Elwyn's courage moves you, give us a like. It takes 2 seconds and it means everything to us. Now, let's go back to that crate. The settlement of Rattlesnake Hollow had never been a pretty place. It was the kind of town that existed because men needed somewhere to drink between shifts in the mines, somewhere to sleep that wasn't the frozen ground, somewhere to pretend civilization still applied to them even when their behavior made that claim questionable. It had 2 saloons, a general store that overcharged for everything, a livery stable that smelled worse than the animals inside it, and roughly 60 souls who had all come west believing something better was waiting, and had collectively discovered that better was a lie told to people who hadn't yet been cold enough. By the time November closed its fist around the valley, Rattlesnake Hollow had maybe 40 people left. The rest had moved on, given up, or died, sometimes all 3 in that order. Elwyn had arrived there 3 years earlier as Harlan Price's wife, which was a title that had never meant what she once hoped it would. She had been 20 when she married him. That was the first mistake, though it didn't feel like a mistake at the time. At 20, in a farming community where your options were marry early or become a burden on your father's household, Harlan Price had seemed like a reasonable prospect. He was handsome in a rough sort of way. He worked. He didn't hit her during the courtship, which, she would later understand, was not a low bar so much as a warning sign she had been too young to recognize as one. Men who will eventually hit you are often extraordinarily charming beforehand. The hitting started 6 months into the marriage, not every day. That was the cruelest part. If it had been every day, she might have understood it as a pattern, something predictable she could brace against. Instead, it came in weeks of relative quiet followed by an eruption she could never quite predict, triggered by things that seemed random, a meal slightly too salty, a word said in the wrong tone, a look he interpreted as disrespect, a loss at cards that somehow became her fault. She had told herself for a long time that it would get better. Then she found out she was carrying Toby, and she told herself she would leave before the baby was born, that she would find a way. She didn't find a way. Toby arrived in February, in a drafty cabin outside a settlement that was already failing, delivered by a woman named Agnes, who drank as heavily as Harlan and had hands that shook. Elwyn lay on a straw mattress and pushed her son into the world and held him against her chest, and for a few hours, maybe the only clear, uncomplicated few hours of her adult life, she felt something uncomplicated and enormous. Love, yes, but also something harder to name. Something like, I will not let the same thing happen to you. That promise was easier to make than to keep. Harlan took one look at the baby and said, another mouth. Not congratulations, not wonder, not even acknowledgement that Elwyn had just done something that had killed women he knew. Just another mouth she should have left then. She knew that in the clear light of memory. But leaving required money she didn't have, direction she didn't know how to find, and the physical recovery from childbirth that left her unable to walk without pain for 2 weeks. And by the time she could walk, Harlan had taken what little she'd saved and lost it at cards. That was his talent, losing things. By that November, the November of the crate, the night everything changed, Harlan had lost their savings 3 separate times. He had lost the horse. He had lost a debt repayment arrangement with a man named Cutter, who was not the kind of man whose arrangements you lost, and who had sent 2 of his associates to Rattlesnake Hollow with very clear instructions about what would happen if Harlan didn't produce something of value before the week was out. What Harlan produced was his wife and son. He announced it in the saloon first, which was how these things apparently worked in a place where people had stopped pretending about basic human decency. He said he had assets he was willing to auction. He said any man with the means to settle a $50 debt could walk away with a woman who still had her teeth and a healthy infant boy who was, Harlan said with a grin that made Elowen want to disappear into the earth, strong enough to work in a few years. He said that last part like it was a selling point. Elowen was in the cabin when his associate came to get her. She had heard the rumors. The settlement was small enough that news moved faster than weather, and she had spent 20 minutes deciding what to take and what to leave. She took Toby's extra blanket. She took the small folding knife she kept inside her left boot, the one Harlan didn't know about. She took nothing else, because nothing else was hers. She walked out of that cabin into the November dark carrying her son, and she told herself she was not afraid. She was afraid. The crowd gathered around the crate was not large, maybe 20 men, plus the few women who worked at the saloon and had come out to watch with expressions that mixed sympathy with the carefully managed distance of people who knew better than to involve themselves. The torches made everyone's faces look worse than they probably were, shadows exaggerating the hunger in people's eyes. Harlan made her stand on the crate so everyone could see her. He actually made her do that. She climbed up without a word because the alternative was making a scene that would accomplish nothing except giving Harlan an excuse to humiliate her in additional ways. And she stood there with Toby against her chest and her jaw set and her eyes level, staring at a point somewhere above the crowd's heads, refusing to look at any of them directly. The bidding started at $20. It climbed faster than she expected, which told her something about the quality of the men in that crowd that she didn't particularly want to know. A man with a red beard she didn't know his name offered $35. A younger man near the back pushed it to $40. An older miner who had been watching her in the saloon for 2 weeks with an expression she had learned to avoid pushed it to $45 and then stood there smiling in a way that made her stomach close like a fist. She tightened her hold on Toby. The baby was awake, watching the torchlight with the uncomplicated fascination of 7-month-olds who don't yet understand that the world can be dangerous. His eyes caught the light and held it. He made a small sound, not crying, just observing, and Elowen felt the knife in her boot like a last option, like a door she hadn't decided yet whether to open. The older miner pushed the bid to $50. He looked at Elowen when he said it, not at Harlan. Cutter's associate, a thick-necked man named Dawes, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd the whole time, nodded slowly. 50 covered the debt. This was apparently going to be settled tonight. Elowen calculated the distance to the tree line, maybe 70 yards. In the dark, carrying Toby through snow that came up to her knees in places. She would never make it. The men in this crowd knew this terrain better than she did. And even if she ran, there was nowhere to run to. The nearest settlement with women and decent people was 4 days south, assuming the passes were clear, which they were not. She didn't run. She stood on the crate, and then the crowd shifted. Not dramatically, not like a wave. More like the way a crowd shifts when someone very large walks. Through it, people moving out of the way, not because they've been pushed, but because the alternative involves being between something large and wherever it's going, and none of them want to be there. The man who walked out of the darkness at the edge of the torchlight was not at first impression impressive in any conventional sense. He was tall, genuinely tall, not the exaggerated tall of men who wore extra boot leather to seem bigger, and broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested actual labor rather than vanity. He was wearing a coat made from something dark and heavy that Eowyn didn't immediately identify as bear fur. His face was scarred across the left cheek and jaw, old scars that had healed badly, the kind left by something that had meant to do permanent damage, and had mostly succeeded. His hair was dark and long enough to brush his collar, and he moved with the particular deliberateness of someone who had long ago stopped being in a hurry because they had discovered that the world would wait. He stopped at the edge of the crate. He looked at Eowyn. Not the way the other men had been looking at her. Not with appetite, not with calculation, not with whatever the older miner was running behind his eyes. He looked at her the way a man looks at a situation he is assessing for all its variables. Then he looked at Harlan. "What's the number?" he said. His voice was low, not soft, there was nothing soft about it, but low, the way ground is low. Solid, something you could stand on. Harlan blinked. Even Harlan, who was drunk enough to have just auctioned his wife, seemed to understand that this was a different kind of moment than the one he'd been managing. 50 covers the debt, he said, and his voice had lost about half its volume. But there have been other bids. Man wants the woman. He needs to top. The stranger reached inside his coat. He pulled out a leather pouch and dropped it on the crate near Harlan's feet. It landed with a sound that every man in that crowd recognized immediately, the dense, heavy sound of significant gold. "Count it," the stranger said. Harlan fumbled with the pouch. His fingers, thick and clumsy with cold and drink, spilled some of the coins onto the wood, and he scrambled to count them. And as he counted, his face went through a series of expressions. First, the focused concentration of a man counting money. Then something approaching surprise. Then something closer to an uncertainty he hadn't anticipated when he'd started this evening. The older miner, the one with 50 on the table, took one look at the stranger and found somewhere else to be. He stepped back into the crowd and then, quietly, was no longer part of it. The man with the red beard had already gone. Dawes, Cutter's associate, was watching with the careful expression of a man deciding whether this solved his problem or created a new one. "This is," Harlan started, and his voice did something complicated. "This is $120. I know what it is," the stranger said. "That's more than... It's enough to cover your debt, buy your supplies, and give you whatever's left over to lose at the next table you sit down at." The stranger said it with the flatness of someone delivering weather information. "Which, from everything I can see, is exactly what you're going to do with it." The crowd was very quiet. Harlan looked at the gold and he looked at the stranger, and Eowyn watched her husband do the arithmetic of a man who had already decided that his self-interest was his only operating principle, and she saw the moment the decision finalized in his eyes. "Done," Harlan said. The word hit Eowyn somewhere behind her sternum, and she breathed through it, and she thought, this is what being sold feels like. It feels like a man saying one word with money in his hand. The stranger turned to look at her. She met his eyes. They were dark brown, maybe, though the torchlight made color unreliable, and they held something she couldn't immediately read. Not cruelty, not hunger, something more like, "I know exactly what I just did, and I'm prepared for you to hate me for it." "Can you walk?" he said. It was such a specific question. Not, "Come with me," not, "You're mine now," not any of the things she had been bracing herself to hear. Just, "Can you walk?" Like her physical capacity was the relevant variable. "Yes," she said. "The baby, he's warm enough?" She looked down at Toby, who was watching the stranger with that same uncomplicated torchlight fascination. "He needs to be warmer than this." The stranger reached up, and she made herself not flinch, which cost her something, and he took off the outer layer of what she'd thought was a single coat, but was apparently 2 coats worn together, a heavy outer shell over a lined inner layer. He handed the outer coat up to her without a word. It was warm, unreasonably, almost shockingly warm, the way things are warm when a large body has been heating them for hours. She wrapped it around Toby without thanking him, because she hadn't decided yet whether this man deserved thanks for purchasing her, even if the purchase was marginally better than the alternative. She climbed down from the crate. Her legs were steadier than she expected, or maybe just numb, and she stood on the frozen ground and looked up at the stranger who now, according to every law this territory recognized, owned her. "My name is Silas Rourke," he said. "Not you'll call me sir. Not do as I say." Just his name offered like information. "Elowin Price," she said. "This is Toby." Silas looked at Toby for a moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't entirely track. Brief, complicated, and then gone, replaced by the same careful flatness. "There's a climb ahead," he said. "It'll take most of the night." "Can you keep pace?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've never climbed a mountain. You'll learn," he said. He turned and walked toward the darkness at the edge of the settlement, and after a moment, because the alternative was standing in the settlement where Harlan still was, where the older miner was somewhere in the shadows, where nothing was safe or knowable, Elowin Price followed the scarred stranger into the dark. Behind her, she heard Harlan say something to the men around him. She didn't catch the words. She didn't turn around to hear them better. She had made her last decision inside Rattlesnake Hollow. Whatever came next would be decided somewhere else. Cold wrapped around her as she left the last of the torchlight behind, and the only warmth she could feel was the coat around Toby and her own heartbeat, which was fast and frightened and stubbornly, defiantly still going. Silas walked ahead of her. He didn't look back to check whether she was following, which meant he already understood something she hadn't yet, that she had nowhere else to go. What she didn't know, walking into that darkness with her son pressed against her chest and her hand near the knife in her boot, was that Silas Rourke understood something else too. Something about why he had paid that money. Something about what he had actually purchased and what he hadn't. She would find that out later, after the climb, after the cold. After everything she thought she knew about men and safety and what survival actually required got taken apart and rebuilt from different material. The mountain waited ahead of them in the dark. Toby made a small sleepy sound against her chest. And Elowin walked forward. The climb nearly killed her. Not in any dramatic cinematic sense. No moment where she slipped and dangled over a cliff edge while Alcilis caught her wrist at the last second. It was worse than that. It was the slow, grinding, humiliating kind of nearly dying that nobody makes stories about. The kind where your legs simply stop working correctly, where your lungs start refusing to process air at the volume you require, where the cold gets inside your clothing, and then inside your skin, and then starts working on something deeper that you don't have a word for. The path, if it could be called that, went up at angles that didn't seem designed for human bodies. Silas moved through the dark with the confidence of a man who had walked this route so many times that his feet remembered it independent of his eyes. He didn't use a torch. He didn't offer her one. There was moonlight, broken by cloud cover, giving them just enough visibility to make the darkness feel more threatening than if it had been total. Elowin followed his silhouette and did not ask him to slow down. She wanted to. Twice, the first hour she opened her mouth to say something, and then closed it again, because asking felt like the first concession in an arrangement she didn't yet understand the rules of. If she showed weakness now, if she let him see that she was already struggling while they were still in the foothills, she didn't know what that information would cost her. Toby slept against her chest. Whatever Toby had, that infant capacity for unconsciousness, regardless of circumstances, Elowin envied it profoundly. Around the second hour, Silas stopped. He didn't say anything. He just stopped walking and turned around and looked at her in the thin moonlight, and Elowin realized she had been staggering for the last 20 minutes without fully registering it. Her feet were finding the ground slightly late each step, her balance doing that thing where it works harder and harder until it suddenly doesn't work at all. "When did you last eat?" Silas said. She thought about it honestly. "Yesterday morning." She stopped. She didn't need to explain the economics of Harlan's household to this man. "Yesterday morning. He reached into the pack on his back. She hadn't paid much attention to it. She'd been focused on not falling, and produced something wrapped in cloth. He held it out. She looked at it. "It's venison," he said. "Dried. It won't poison you. I didn't think it would." "You're looking at it like it might." She took it. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking, not from cold, or not only from cold. She bit into the dried meat and chewed, and it was salty and tough, and the best thing she had tasted in recent memory, which said something about recent memory. Silas watched her eat without comment. Then he looked at Toby, still sleeping against her chest. "How old?" he said. 7 months, he's strong? "Yes." She said it quickly, with more force than the question required, because the question scraped against something she was protective of. "He's healthy. He's fine. He's a good baby." Silas nodded once. Not the nod of a man reassured, more the nod of a man filing information. "We've got another 4 hours, maybe more. The snow's deeper above the first ridge." 4 hours. She looked up at the mountain above them, which was mostly invisible in the dark and therefore felt infinite, and she thought about 4 more hours of this with her legs already unreliable. And she said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. "Give me the boy," Silas said. Everything in her went rigid. "No," she said. It came out flat and immediate, the kind of no that doesn't include explanation because the explanation feels unnecessary, the kind of no that is its own complete sentence. She pulled Toby slightly tighter against her, without thinking about it, the automatic repositioning of a body that has already decided. Silas looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression, not irritation, not the calculation of a man deciding whether to push something quieter. Something that might have been recognition. "I'm not taking him from you," he said. "I'm saying you're going to fall in the next mile. The snow gets deeper, and the trail gets steeper, and you haven't eaten in a day. If you fall while you're carrying him, he gets hurt." She stared at him. "I carry him," Silas continued. In the same flat, practical voice, "You fall, you get hurt. That's easier to fix." The logic was sound. The logic was so transparently, straightforwardly sound that she hated it, because she wanted a reason to say no that wasn't just fear, and he had just removed all the reasonable ones. What she had left was the unreasonable one, that she didn't know this man, that she had been sold to him 3 hours ago, that she did not hand her child to strangers in the dark on the side of a mountain. "He doesn't know you," she said. "He'll wake up and—" "Then he'll cry," Silas said, "and I'll give him back to you. But you'll be standing when that happens, instead of lying face down in the snow." Elowyn looked at her son's face, barely visible in the moonlight. He was sleeping with his mouth slightly open, his breath a small regular cloud in the cold air. She transferred Toby to Silas's arms. She did it the way you do something you've decided is necessary but haven't decided is safe quickly, before the fear could fully articulate itself. Silas took the baby with a matter-of-factness that surprised her. He didn't adjust Toby awkwardly or hold him at arm's length the way some men held infants, like the baby might detonate. He settled the boy against his chest and shifted the carry with the slight calibration of someone thinking about weight distribution, and Toby traitorously, as far as Elowyn was concerned, didn't wake up. "Let's go," Silas said, and turned back up the mountain. She followed him with empty arms that felt wrong in a way she couldn't entirely account for. They climbed. The first ridge was everything Silas had promised. Snow that came to her knee in places, a trail that required using her hands on the steeper sections, wind that came over the top of the ridge with a focus and intensity that felt personal. She fell twice. The first time she caught herself on her palms, and the cold of the snow burned through her gloves, thin things not made for this altitude, and she pushed herself up and kept moving. The second time she went down harder, one knee hitting rock under the snow, and she made a sound she hadn't intended to make. Silas turned around. "I'm fine," she said before he could speak. "I can see that," he said, which was clearly not true, but he said it in a tone that didn't make her feel assessed or pitied, just acknowledged, and he waited until she was standing again before he turned back. Toby woke up somewhere on the second ridge. The cry was immediate and total, the way infant distress always is, with no warm-up period and no gradation, just silence and then sudden, complete protest. Silas stopped walking and turned and held Toby out, and Elowyn crossed the distance between them and took her son and held him close and made the sounds that mothers make. The low, rhythmic nonsense sounds that work because of what they are rather than what they mean. And Toby quieted within a few minutes. Then he was cold, because her body heat was lower than Silas's, and he started fussing again, and Silas did something that stopped her cold. He stepped close, not grabbing, not presuming, just close, and opened his coat, and held it out to the sides, creating a windbreak around Elowyn and the baby together. She stood inside the shelter of his coat for 2 minutes while Toby calmed down and the wind went around them, and she was aware of how strange the geography of this moment was, this enormous, scarred man she didn't know creating a wall between her son and the winter, and doing it without asking for anything in return or even mentioning that he was doing it. When Toby was quiet, Silas closed his coat and turned back up the mountain. "Thank you," she said to his back. He didn't respond. Just kept walking. She followed him, and she thought about that, the not responding, and she couldn't decide if it was rudeness or just the communication style of a man who had spent too much time alone. Either way, he'd done the thing without expectation of acknowledgement, which was its own kind of statement. The cabin appeared in the darkness without much announcement. She'd been watching for it for the last hour, expecting it the way you expect something you've been promised. And it materialized from the dark as a solid rectangle of deeper dark against the snow, a structure that was unmistakably built to withstand serious weather rather than to look welcoming. Low roof, heavy walls, small windows. A barn or stable structure about 30 feet away. Smoke coming from somewhere at the roof. "You kept the fire going," she said, confused. "You were in the settlement. Banked it before I left," Silas said. 3 days ago. These logs will hold a bed of coals for a long time if you set them right." He pushed open the door no lock, and the warmth came out and hit her like a physical thing, like something she hadn't realized she needed until it arrived. And she walked inside with Toby and stood in the middle of the small cabin and just breathed it in. The interior was exactly what she expected from the outside, functional. A single large room with a fireplace at one end, a sleeping area with a rough wooden bed frame, a table, 2 chairs of mismatched construction, shelves holding supplies organized with military precision, animal pelts covering portions of the floor, tools hanging on every available wall space. Clean in the way that a very organized person working alone keeps things clean, rather than the way a domestic household keeps things clean. No softness, no decoration, no concession to the idea that a home should feel like anything other than a shelter. Silas moved to the fireplace and began working the coals back to flame without removing his coat. Elowyn looked at the bed. "One bed. Where do you sleep?" she asked. "Same place I always sleep." She turned to look at him. "There's a bedroll," he said, not looking up from the fire. "I'll take the floor. You take the bed. Put the boy next to the wall so he can't roll out." She stood there for a moment, waiting for the rest of it. Waiting for the but, for the condition, for the moment when the thing she'd been waiting for since he laid that gold at Harlan's feet finally arrived. It didn't arrive. "I need to tell you something," Silas said. He had the fire going now, and he stood up from the hearth and turned around, and his face in the firelight was not exactly gentle. It wasn't built for that, but it was direct. "What I paid for tonight, the money at the settlement." "I know what happened," she said carefully. "I want to be clear what it was," he said. "Debt paid on your behalf, not a purchase." She looked at him. "I don't own you," he said. "I don't own him." A slight movement of his head toward Toby. "You're not property. What happened back there with that man?" Something flickered across his face that she couldn't fully read. "That doesn't get replicated here. You sleep safely. The boy eats, you work. Because we both work, and working is how we survive the winter. That's the arrangement, that's all of it." The fire cracked behind him. Toby made a small sound against her shoulder. Elowen had spent 3 years listening for the lie inside everything Harlan said, the small architectural difference between what he promised and what he intended, the fracture line where the words stopped matching the reality. She listened for it now, parsing Silas's flat declaration with everything she'd learned about men who said one thing and did another. She couldn't find it, which scared her more than if she had. Why, she said. Why what? Why pay that much? You could have, she stopped. You could have left, or offered less, or not been there at all. Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fire rather than at her, and she got the impression this was what he did when a question required actual consideration rather than deflection. I come down to the settlement for supplies twice a year, he said finally. I've been watching Rattlesnake Hollow fall apart for 3 years. Watching men make decisions they shouldn't be allowed to make. A pause. I saw what that man was planning to do. I had the means to stop it. I did. Just like that. Just like that. You don't know me. No, he agreed. You spent $120 on a woman and a baby you'd never met. The gold doesn't change anything for me up here, he said. I don't have a great deal of use for it. What I have use for is not watching something like that happen and doing nothing. He picked up a log and set it carefully on the fire. I would have done it for anyone in that situation. Elowen believed him. She didn't want to believe felt dangerous, felt like a thing she couldn't afford, but she believed him anyway, because there was something in the way he said it that wasn't performance. It didn't have the shape of a man trying to impress her. It had the shape of a man explaining a calculation that seemed obvious to him. She moved Toby to the bed and arranged the blankets around him with the careful architecture of a mother who had learned to do this in the cold, building him a small fortress of wool and heat, and when she straightened up her legs, nearly went out from under her. She caught the edge of the bed frame and held it until the wave of exhaustion passed. Eat something before you sleep, Silas said from across the room. Bread, left shelf. She wanted to say she wasn't hungry. She was extremely hungry. She found the bread dents dark, the kind baked to last rather than to taste like anything in particular, and she ate a piece standing up, and when she finished it, she sat down on the edge of the bed next to Toby and didn't get back up, because her body had apparently made a decision that didn't require her input. She was asleep before she made any conscious choice to be. She woke once in the night, confused by the unfamiliar darkness, and heard Silas's breathing from the floor. Steady, slow, not the breathing of a man pretending to sleep while watching her. A man sleeping. Toby was warm beside her. She closed her eyes again. The first 2 weeks were the most uncomfortable of her adult life, which was saying something, given that her adult life had included 3 years with Harlan Price. It wasn't what she feared. That was the difficult thing to calibrate, the gap between what she braced for and what actually arrived each morning. She woke every day expecting the shift, the moment when Silas's patience ran out, or his true intentions clarified, or the man she'd seen at the auction crate proved to be a performance over something uglier. She cataloged his moods the way she'd learned to catalog Harlan's. She watched for the small signs, tightening of the jaw, a particular quality of silence, the way a man moves when he's building toward something. What she got instead was routine. Silas rose before light. He was quiet about it, not performing quietness, not tiptoeing with theatrical consideration, just not making unnecessary noise because unnecessary noise served no purpose. He built up the fire. He went out to tend the animals. He came back and made whatever passed for breakfast in a mountain cabin in November, which was usually a porridge that tasted of nothing remarkable but was genuinely warming. And he put a portion of it on the table without announcing it and went about his own business. The first morning she sat at the table and ate and watched him and said nothing. He said nothing. The silence was not hostile. It was just silence. The specific silence of two people who don't yet have a language for each other. The second morning, she fed Toby first and then ate, and Silas, who was working on a piece of harness leather that had split, glanced up at the sound of Toby's contentment noises and then back down at his work. He's a loud eater, Silas said. He's enthusiastic, Elowen said. Something happened in the corner of Silas's mouth that might have been, in better lighting, a very small smile. Then it was gone, and he was back to the harness. By the end of the first week, she understood the basic structure of his days, and she began filling in the spaces she could fill without being asked. She was not a woman who sat idle well. Harlan had told her she was useless so many times that some part of her had almost believed it, but the truth was that she had been running a household since she was 13, and her hands knew things her uncertainty tried to argue her out of. She organized the food stores on the third day, which needed doing. Silas's system was logical for one person, but didn't account for the additional consumption of a woman and growing infant, and when he came in that evening and saw what she'd done, he stood in front of the shelves for a moment and then said, "Good. I was going to do that. I know," she said. "I did it faster." He looked at her. "I'm not trying to." She stopped. "Started again. I need something to do. I can't sit here being kept." "Nobody's keeping you. You know what I mean." Another moment of that careful consideration. "What can you do?" "Cook. Preserve food. So, I can tan leather, though I'm not as fast as someone who's been doing it longer. I can make soap. I can manage an inventory." She paused. "I'm not afraid of hard work, I can see that," he said. "Starting tomorrow, I've got hides that need working and a smokehouse that needs someone managing it while I'm out." "Fine. You'll need different gloves," he said, looking at her hands. "Those are useless up here. I've got a spare pair." The gloves he produced the next morning were massive on her built for his hands, wrapped around hers with room to spare, and she wore them anyway because he was right. Her own were useless. And she spent that first day in the smokehouse learning how the ventilation worked, how long different meats wanted, how to read the smoke without letting it get away from her. She got it wrong twice. She didn't tell him. She corrected it and moved on. Toby, who was developing opinions about the world with increasing clarity, had decided that Silas was interesting. This happened incrementally. First, it was just watching him babies watch large moving things, what they do. But by the second week, Toby was craning towards Silas whenever he came into the room with the directional enthusiasm of a small person who has identified a source of novelty. Silas noticed. He didn't make a production of it, but he began to do small things. He would pause near Toby and hold out a finger, and Toby would grab it and hold on with that improbable infant grip strength, and Silas would look at the small hand wrapped around his scarred finger with an expression that was complicated. Something private that Elowen felt she wasn't supposed to see. She looked away when it happened, the same way you look away from a thing that feels too unguarded for direct observation. The crisis arrived in the third week. It arrived as a sound, which was how most crises arrived on the mountain, something outside the expected range of noise that landed differently than the wind or the animals or the structure settling in the cold. She heard it while she was alone in the cabin, Silas having gone to check the trapline 2 hours earlier. A heavy, wet scraping sound at the door. Her first thought was that something was trying to get in. Then the scraping came again, more uneven, and she recognized it as the sound of someone trying to get purchase on the door from the outside. Not the confident knock of a visitor, the desperate scrabble of someone who couldn't knock. She took the knife from her boot. She'd never stopped keeping it there. That felt like a habit she needed to maintain regardless of anything else, and opened the door. Silas fell through it. He went down across the threshold in a way that had no grace in it, no controlled descent, just a large man whose body had stopped cooperating. And the sound he made when he hit the floor was the sound of someone past the point of managing their own pain response. He was on his side, and she could see, even in the bad light, even in the first second of comprehension, the dark spread of blood across his coat. Too much blood. The wrong color, the dark arterial red that meant this wasn't a surface wound. "Silas," she dropped to her knees beside him. "Silas, look at me." His eyes found her. They were focused, which meant something good, but the color of his face meant something considerably less good. "Cat," he said, "on the north ridge. Got me before—" He stopped. His jaw worked, before I could get clear. "Mountain lion." She pulled his coat open, and the full picture of it arrived, and she made herself look at it directly, not flinch from it, made herself assess rather than react. 3 claw marks across his left side and lower chest, deep and ragged, the kind of wounds that a very large animal makes when it means to finish something. One was bleeding badly. The others were bad but not immediately lethal if managed. There was no doctor. She knew that. She had known that since the first day on this mountain. The nearest settlement was a descent she couldn't make alone, and even if she couldn't leave Toby. And even if she could do all of that, Silas would be dead by the time she returned with help. She had approximately the next hour to decide what kind of person she was. "I need you to stay awake," she said. "I know," he said. "Can you get to the bed if I help you?" Maybe. It wasn't maybe. It was enormous effort, his weight distributed across her shoulders and her back and her determination. And he made sounds that she didn't think he would have made if he'd had any other option. And they covered the 6 feet to the bed in what felt like much longer than 6 feet. He went down onto the mattress and lay back, and she could see him making the decision to breathe. Not doing it automatically, actually making the decision. Which meant the pain was doing things to his autonomic function that needed attention immediately. Elowen had set broken bones before. She had packed wounds with poultice and wrapped them tightly. She had taken an arrow out of her brother's thigh when she was 16, during a time and place when that was a thing women did, because there was no alternative. She had not done anything like this. She did it anyway. She found his supply kit. He was organized, which was the one piece of luck in this situation. His medical supplies were exactly where a careful man would keep them, and she inventoried what she had while simultaneously tearing his shirt away from the wounds and applying pressure with the cleanest material she could find, which was the spare shirt she'd been using as Toby's sleeping pad. "This is going to hurt significantly," she said. "I'm aware," Silas said through his teeth. "I mean the cleaning more than the pressure. Do what you need to do." The whiskey she used was whiskey she'd found in his supplies and hadn't touched because it seemed important not to touch it, not to use his things without permission. And now she poured it without hesitation into the deepest wound, while Silas made a sound that came up from somewhere deep in his chest and then stopped, controlled by will. "Still awake," she said. "Yes," he said. The word was compressed, built from effort. "Good. Keep being awake." She had never stitched a wound before. She had sewn leather, which was harder. And she told herself this was the same logic, if not the same material. And she threaded the heavy needle she found in his kit, a curved one, like a sailmaker's needle, which was closer to what she needed than a straight one, and she worked. Her hand shook during the first 3 stitches and steadied after that. Not because she became less afraid, but because the work required her hands to be steady, and so they were. Silas did not lose consciousness. She had expected him to, was braced for the complication of working on someone who couldn't tell her how the pain was presenting. But he stayed awake with the stubborn persistence of a man who had apparently decided that losing consciousness was a concession he wasn't willing to make. He breathed. He held still. When he couldn't hold still twice, when she hit something that sent a spasm through him, he warned her first. "Going to move," he said the second time. "Sorry." "Don't apologize," she said, not looking up from her work. "Just tell me first." Toby, meanwhile, had woken up sometime during all of this and was sitting in his makeshift cot, watching the proceedings with the focused interest of a child who doesn't yet have a category for this being unusual. He wasn't crying. He was watching. Elowen talked to him occasionally, not about what she was doing, just sounds, the reassuring low stream of parental noise, and he seemed to accept this as a reasonable response to the situation. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at her work. It was not beautiful. The stitches were even but not elegant, functional rather than precise. There were 11 of them across the deepest wound, and the 2 shallower wounds she had packed and wrapped because stitching them would have required more resources than the benefit warranted. She had done what she could. Whether it was enough depended on factors she couldn't entirely control, whether infection set in, Whether she'd missed something internally that she couldn't reach, whether Silas's body had anything left to fight with. She washed her hands in the basin and looked at him. "How bad is it?" he said. His voice was rough but present. "Honest answer, please." "I've done what I can," she said. "The bleeding is managed. The wounds are as clean as I can get them. You'll run a fever. How bad the fever gets and how long it lasts is going to tell us most of what we need to know." He looked at the ceiling. "You stitched me up." "Yes." "You've done that before?" "No." A pause. It felt competent. "Thank you," she said dryly. "I mean it," he said. I'm not being easy about this. You did a competent job on a bad wound without training and without losing your head. That's not a small thing." She didn't know what to do with that. So she stood up and went to check on Toby. And she spent a few minutes doing the automatic logistics of motherhood, feeding him, changing him, talking him back towards sleep. And when she came back to check on Silas, he was watching her. "What were you before?" he said. "Before the settlement." "Before Price." She considered how much of that to answer. "A farmer's daughter," she said. "One of 5 children. We didn't have much, but we worked hard and She stopped. "We were fine. Things were fine. And then I made a choice that I was too young to understand the full consequences of." She sat down in the chair beside the bed. Harlan seemed like something. He seemed like ambition and forward motion. "I was 20 years old and I thought ambition was the same thing as character." A pause. "It isn't." "No," Silas agreed quietly. "It isn't." "What were you?" she said. "Before here." He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "Then I had a family. A different life. Down south, farming country." "Didn't he stop?" "It ended. And I came here." "That's the short version. You don't have to give me the long version." "I know," he said. "Maybe sometime." The fever arrived that night as she had predicted. For 3 days Elowen barely slept. She managed the fire, fed Toby, cooled Silas's skin with wet cloths when his temperature climbed into the range that worried her, forced water between his lips with the patience of someone who understood that hydration was doing most of the work she couldn't do herself. She talked to him during the bad stretches, not because she thought he could hear her, but because silence during those hours felt dangerous, felt like something she needed to fill with proof of presence. She talked about her childhood, about the farm, the way morning light looked over a winter field, the particular smell of bread baking in a stone oven. She talked about Toby, about the afternoon he first laughed, a sound that had come out of him so suddenly that she'd laughed too, a real laugh. One of maybe 7 she could remember in the past 3 years. She talked about small things, ordinary things, the texture of ordinary life that she'd been so thoroughly removed from that remembering it felt like describing a foreign country. On the second night, Silas said her name. She was awake. She was always awake. And she put her hand on his forehead, and it was cooler than it had been. Not cool, but moving in the right direction. "Still here," she said. "Good," he said. And his voice was still rough, but it had more substance under it. "The boy, he's fine. He's asleep." "Good." A long exhale. "You should sleep." "I will when you're through the worst of it." Silence, then. "Why are you still here?" It wasn't quite a question. It had the shape of something he'd been carrying for a while, something he was releasing rather than asking. "What do you mean?" she said. "I couldn't have stopped you," he said. "The past 3 days. I couldn't have gotten up." "You could have. There are supplies here." "Enough to get down the mountain. You could have gone." She looked at him in the firelight, his face pale and stripped of its usual guardedness by the fever, and she thought about how to answer that honestly. "No," she said finally. "No, you couldn't have gone, or no, you wouldn't have." She thought about it. "Both," she said. He looked at her for a moment, something shifting in his eyes that she couldn't entirely name. "The arrangement," he said carefully. "What I told you when we got here. About what the money was and wasn't. I remember." "I need you to know I meant it." "I know," she said. "Even now." Even stopped. "Nothing changes it. Whatever you see when you look at what I've done these past weeks. I didn't do it to build a debt. I don't want. He stopped again, and she could see him navigating something with the care of a man who doesn't speak easily about the things that matter to him. I'm not asking for anything. I want to be clear about that. Elowyn sat in the chair beside Hisbit in the firelight, in the mountain cabin that 3 weeks ago had been the most frightening destination she could imagine, and she looked at the man who had carried her son up a mountain and slept on the floor and handed her a knife and told her she could defend herself even against him, who was now lying here with her stitches in his skin, telling her from a fever bed, with great effort, that he didn't want anything from her. Something cracked open in her chest, not dramatically, not all at once, more like the first fracture in ice that has been under too much pressure for too long. A sound you feel rather than hear. Sleep, she said. We can talk about it later. Silas closed his eyes. His breathing steadied. Toby made a small sound from his cot and then went quiet. Outside the cabin, the wind moved through the high pine and dropped more snow from the upper branches. It hit the roof in small, quiet falls, and the fire breathed in and out. And Elowyn Price sat in a chair in the warm dark and put her face in her hands, not in despair, not exactly, and stayed there until the worst of it had passed through her. Then she straightened up. She checked Silas's forehead. Cooler, definitely cooler. She added a log to the fire. She sat back down and watched the door, the rifle leaning against the wall 3 feet from where she sat, and she thought about what it meant that she had put it there 3 days ago without thinking about it. Not against Silas, never against Silas, but against the mountain, against whatever the mountain might send next, against anything that came through that door uninvited. She had put it there. She had known to put it there. The woman on the crate in Rattlesnake Hollow would not have known to do that. Outside, the snow kept falling. Silas's fever broke on the morning of the 4th day. Not with drama, not with the kind of sudden clarity that stories sometimes assign to recovery, just a gradual shift that Elowyn noticed at around 4 in the morning when she put her hand to his forehead and found it damp rather than burning. The difference between a fire at full rage and a fire that has finally consumed what it needed to consume and is settling into something manageable. She sat there with her hand on his forehead for a long moment, feeling that shift, and the relief that moved through her was so physical it made her legs weak. She had not let herself fully feel afraid while it was happening. Fear during the crisis would have made her hands shake at the wrong moments, would have put hesitation into decisions that needed to be made without hesitation. But now, in the 4 in the morning quiet with the fever finally broken, the fear arrived retroactively and hit her all at once. The fear of what it would have meant if the fever hadn't broken, if the infection had gone deeper, if the stitches had failed, or the wounds had putrefied, or any of a dozen things she had spent 3 days holding at bay with sheer determined forward motion. She sat in the chair and breathed through it. Toby was asleep. The fire was steady. Silas was breathing with the slow depth of genuine sleep rather than the shallow, troubled breathing of the fever. She let herself be afraid for about 10 minutes, and then she set it down because there wasn't anywhere to put it, and they still had the rest of the winter ahead of them. Silas woke around dawn. He turned his head and found her in the chair, where she had been more or less continuously for 3 days, and for a moment he just looked at her with the open, uncalculated expression of someone not yet fully returned to consciousness, a look she'd never seen on his face before, stripped of the careful guardedness he wore during waking hours. "Morning," he said. "Your fever broke," she said. He seemed to process that. He moved one hand experimentally, then made a short, controlled sound at what the movement cost him. How long? 4 days since the lion, 3 days of fever. He closed his eyes briefly, like he was counting something. The animals. I've been managing them. He opened his eyes. You don't know how. I figured it out, she said. The goat was straightforward. The mule was difficult the first morning. And then we reached an understanding. Something moved across his face. You and the mule reached an understanding. I brought him an extra measure of feed and stopped trying to approach him from the left side. He stopped trying to remove my arm from my body. We're getting along adequately. Silas lay there looking at the ceiling for a moment. I need to sit up. You should wait another day. I need to see the wounds. I can tell you about the wounds. Elowen. It was the first time he had used her name without it being attached to something else. Not Elowen. Can you walk? Not Elowen. Eat something. Just her name. Standing alone. She wasn't sure he'd noticed he'd done it. She helped him sit up, which was a significant undertaking involving the headboard and a folded hide behind his back, and 2 attempts before they found a position that worked. He looked down at the bandaging and then at her. Can I see it? He said. She unwrapped the outer layer and let him look at her stitching. The wounds were doing what she'd hoped red at the edges, but not the deep angry red of infection moving outward, the skin holding, the stitches intact. His jaw moved slightly as he examined it, and she couldn't tell if that was assessment or something more personal. This is clean work, he said finally. I told you last time you mentioned it. I'd never done it before. I know what you told me. He looked up at her. I'm telling you it's clean work. That's not the same as saying it was easy. She looked away because the directness of it landed somewhere she wasn't ready for. You should eat something if you can manage it. The recovery took longer than either of them acknowledged it was taking. Silas was not a good patient in the sense of being a compliant one. He was not difficult. He didn't argue or refuse things outright, but he had a persistent tendency to assess himself as more functional than he was, to start moving toward tasks before his body had fully authorized the movement, and to cut those attempts short without comment and return to wherever he'd been sitting with the carefully neutral expression of a man who was not going to admit that standing up had just taken most of what he had. Elowen watched this without saying anything, because she understood it. She understood the specific pride of a person who has built their entire survival on their own competence, suddenly confronting the gap between what they need to be able to do and what they can actually do. She had lived in that gap herself, those early weeks on the mountain. She understood that pointing it out helped nothing. What she did instead was arrange the work so that the things requiring physical effort were handled before he could get to them, and the things requiring decision were placed where he could manage them from a seated position. And she did all of this without framing it as accommodation, just as the natural distribution of labor between 2 people in a household, with one of them temporarily limited. He noticed. She could tell he noticed. But he said nothing, just accepted the arrangement with the same flat practicality he applied to everything. And she thought, they were both people who understood that some things were easier to receive when they weren't named. By the end of the 2nd week of his recovery, Silas was moving well enough to be outside for limited periods, and by the 3rd week he was doing the heavier work again. Though more slowly than before and with a caution she'd never seen in him that was new and clearly cost him something to maintain. Scar tissue was forming over the wounds, and she could see it pulling at him when he reached or lifted, a tightness that would be there for a long time, possibly always. December moved into January with the specific brutality of high mountain winter. The cold that arrived in January was not the cold of December, which had been a serious cold, a cold that required attention and preparation. January's cold was a different category of thing absolute, almost geological, the kind of cold that makes you understand viscerally why people talked about winter as a living thing, as something with intent. The temperature dropped in ways that the body processed as personal, as targeted. The snow stopped falling in flakes and started arriving in fine crystalline particles that the wind drove horizontal, that found every gap in clothing and every imperfection in insulation and exploited them without hesitation. Elowen had come from farming country where winter was serious. She had not come from anywhere that had prepared her for this. The cabin became the entire world. She had worried, in the abstract, before January arrived, about what it would feel like to be confined to a small space with a man she didn't know for weeks on end. She had cataloged all the ways it could go wrong, all the pressures that close quarters put on people, all the ways that comfort could erode into irritation and irritation into something uglier. She had watched that happen with Harlan in spaces that were significantly larger than this cabin. She knew what people did to each other when there was nowhere to go. What she had not calculated for was Silas Rourke specifically. He was quiet in a way that turned out to be restful rather than oppressive. He did not require her to perform ease or happiness or gratitude. He did not interpret her silence as a problem to be solved. On the days when Toby was fussy and she was short on sleep, and the cold outside was making the cabin feel like a trap, Silas simply existed alongside her, present and functional, and making no demands on her emotional state whatsoever, which was such a fundamental departure from her experience of living with a man that she kept waiting for it to revert. Didn't revert. What it did instead was slowly build something. Not romance, not yet, not in January, that was not the word for it. More like the construction of trust in the particular way that trust gets built between people who are both cautious, incrementally, almost accidentally, through the accumulation of small moments that individually meant little, but collectively meant a great deal. The morning he showed her the rifle was one of those moments. He came in from checking the animals and set it on the table with a directness that suggested the decision had already been made, and he wasn't announcing it so much as executing it. "I want to show you how this works," he said. She looked at the rifle. It was a long gun, a good one, well-maintained. "Why?" "'Cause you're living on a mountain where things come out of the dark," he said. "And because I was on the North Ridge 4 weeks ago when the cat came. I wasn't here. There are reasons I might not be here. You're teaching me to shoot, if you're willing." She looked at him for a moment, trying to read what was underneath the offer. She had learned to do this with Harlan learned, to look for the transaction in every generosity, the thing being built toward, the leverage being constructed. She looked for it in Silas and found, as she consistently found, something that appeared to just be what it said it was. "I'm willing," she said. He spent 2 mornings teaching her the mechanics of it at the table, dry, how it loaded, how it cleared, how the mechanism worked and what to do when it didn't, all before she ever fired it. She paid attention with the focused thoroughness she'd learned to apply to everything Silas taught her, because everything Silas taught her turned out to be genuinely useful rather than theoretical. The first time she fired it, the recoil surprised her and the shot went wide and she said a word she hadn't said in front of Silas before. He said, "Try again." Not, "It's all right," not, "Good try." Not any of the condescending softening that men sometimes applied to women learning things, the implicit suggestion that the bar was lower. Just try again, which meant the bar was exactly what it was and he expected her to reach it. She tried again. By the end of the second day, she was hitting what she aimed at with consistency that Silas described as adequate, which she was beginning to understand was his version of a significant compliment. "What do I do if the cat comes back?" she said on the walk back to the cabin. "Aim for the chest, largest target, and if it's something else." Same principle applies to most things that come down from the ridge. He paused. Anything that walks on 2 legs comes to this door that you haven't invited. The rifle is the appropriate response, and I won't have a different opinion about it afterwards. She stopped walking. He stopped a half step later and turned to look at her. "You mean that?" she said. "I said it. You're telling me. If someone came to this cabin and I needed to, you're telling me you would defend my decision to use the rifle." "Yes," he said, simply, flatly, without elaboration, in the way he said things that were not complicated to him, even when they were complicated to hear. She stood in the snow and looked at him. This scarred, enormous man who had bought her freedom and given her his floor and taught her to stitch wounds and was now telling her without ceremony that she had the absolute right to defend herself by whatever means necessary. And she thought about what it meant that this was the first time any man had said that to her, that her safety was her own to manage, that the power to protect herself was hers to hold. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way she hadn't meant most things in a long time. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold." January produced a blizzard in its 3rd week that made everything before it seem like a rehearsal. It came with 48 hours of warning, if you knew how to read the sky, which Silas did, and the warning was spent in a grim and focused preparation. Every possible fuel source moved inside, every animal secured. Every potential failure point in the cabin structure addressed with whatever materials were available. Silas moved through these preparations with urgency but not panic, the efficiency of a man who has weathered serious things before and understands that the difference between surviving them and not is mostly about the work done before they arrive. Elowen worked beside him without asking what she should do next. She had learned enough by then to see what needed doing and do it, and the fact that she could do this, that she was no longer a person who needed to be told each step, but a person who could read a situation and respond to it, was something she'd stopped noticing consciously, the way you stop noticing that you can walk once you've been walking long enough. When the blizzard arrived, it was total. The sound of it against the cabin was extraordinary, not loud in the way of an explosion, but loud in the way of something enormous moving past a sustained, comprehensive roar that pressed on the walls and found every weakness in the insulation and sent cold fingers through cracks that had been perfectly adequate in ordinary winter. The windows became opaque with driven snow. The temperature inside dropped despite the fire burning at full capacity, and Elowen spent the first night adding layers to Toby's bedding in increments, monitoring him with the specific anxiety of a mother whose child cannot tell her if he's cold enough. "He's fine," Silas said, from across the cabin, without looking up from where he was working on the door seal. "Babies regulate better than we do when they're bundled." "You know a lot about babies for a man who lives alone," she said. Pause. He kept working on the door seal. "I had a son," he said. "A long time ago," she went still. "Had," she said carefully. "He died," Silas said. "He was 2 fever in the summer." Went fast. He said it with a flatness that had nothing dismissive in it, the flatness of a fact so large it had ground the edges off everything, left it smooth and heavy and permanent. His mother died the following winter. Different sickness. Elowen sat with that for a moment. The fire cracked. Outside, the blizzard said what it had to say at full volume. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was 8 years ago. That doesn't make it less." He looked up from the door then and met her eyes, and something in his expression shifted. Not much, a millimeter, but enough. "No," he said, "it doesn't." She understood then. In the retroactive way, you understand things that were always true, but that you didn't have all the pieces to see clearly. Why he had looked at Toby the way he looked at Toby. Why the expression on his face, when Toby grabbed his finger, was the specific expression it was. Why a man living alone on a mountain with more gold than he needed had gone down to a dying settlement on a November night and spent $120 on a woman and a baby he had never met. Not because she and Toby were replacements. She didn't think that was it. Silas did not seem like a man who operated on that kind of simple substitution. But because he understood, in the specific way that only loss can teach a person, exactly what was at stake on that crate. Exactly what the men bidding understood, and exactly what they intended, and exactly what would happen to Toby if any of those men had taken them instead. She didn't say any of this. She said, "What was his name?" Another pause. "Daniel," Silas said. "We called him Danny." "That's a good name. He was a good boy." His jaw moved. He would have been 10 this past August. She let the silence hold that. After a moment, Silas went back to the door seal. She went back to monitoring Toby's temperature. The blizzard pressed against the cabin from all sides, and the fire worked against it. And the two of them existed in the same space with this new piece of knowledge between them, like something that had changed the dimensions of the room without changing any of the furniture. The blizzard lasted 4 days. By the second day, Elowen had stopped thinking of it as confinement and started thinking of it as enforced proximity, which was a slightly more accurate description of what was actually happening. There was nowhere to go and nothing to do except manage the immediate demands of the cabin, the fire, the food, Toby's needs, and in the gaps between those demands, talk. They talked more in those 4 days than they had in the combined weeks before. Not about important things necessarily, or not only about important things, about the kind of things that two people talk about when the world has narrowed to one room and they've run out of tasks and there's nothing left to do but be in the same space and let that mean something. He told her about the farming country he'd come from, the specific quality of summer heat in a river valley, the way the land smelled after rain. She told him about her family, her sisters, the middle sister, who had been the funniest person she had ever known, and who she had not seen in 4 years and thought about with a regularity that felt like a bruise she kept finding in the dark. "Could you write to her?" Silas said. "I could, if I had a way to send a letter." "Orson Pike comes through in the spring," he said. "He takes mail down with him." She hadn't known that. "A trader comes twice a year, spring and fall. He'll bring whatever I've ordered from the supply list and take down whatever I've got to send." A pause. "He's reliable. Not always pleasant, but reliable." "I haven't written a letter in 4 years," she said. "Letters don't expire," Silas said. She looked at him. Was that a joke? It was a statement. It had the shape of a joke. He looked at her with an expression that was doing something complicated in the vicinity of his eyes. "You can call it what you want," she laughed. It surprised her, the actual surprised laughter of someone caught off guard, short and genuine, and nothing performed about it. Silas watched it happen with an expression she couldn't fully decode, something attentive and careful, like a man watching something unfamiliar that he doesn't want to startle. Toby, who had been attempting to drag himself across the floor in what he was treating as a serious locomotion effort, chose this moment to achieve something in the vicinity of forward momentum for the first time. Covering approximately 8 inches before, face planting into the bearskin rug with a soft thud and looking up at the room with an expression of dignified outrage. I said, It was the least dramatic response to a child's first crawl that Elowen could imagine, and it was so perfectly in keeping with everything she knew about him that she laughed again. And this time he did smile, actually, unmistakably smiled. A brief thing that rearranged his scarred face into something entirely different, and then he was off the chair and on the floor with Toby, setting him back up on his hands and knees with enormous, careful hands and making a sound at him that was low and encouraging. Toby looked at him with intense seriousness and tried again. Elowen sat and watched her son try to crawl toward the scarred mountain man on the cabin floor, and she sat with the feeling that was moving through her without trying to name it or manage it, just letting it be what it was. February came in quiet after January's violence, and with it came the beginning of something that changed the texture of the days in ways Elowen noticed but couldn't immediately articulate. Silas had begun leaving things without explanation. A pair of mittens, small enough to be clearly made for Toby's hands, appeared on the table one morning. Elowen picked them up and looked at the stitching rude but deliberate, the stitching of a man who had figured out the mechanics through persistence rather than practice, and she looked at Silas, who was eating his breakfast and looking at the wall. She put the mittens on Toby's hands. Toby looked at his hands with the expression of someone encountering a new concept. Silas watched this for a moment and then went back to his breakfast. A week later, a small wooden shape appeared beside Toby's sleeping area. She picked it up. It was a bear, roughly carved but unmistakably a bear, with 4 stubby legs and a head at the right angle and enough detail in the face that she understood it had been worked on for a while. She held it for a long time. She understood what these things were. She understood what it meant when a person who did not make gestures began making them. She had spent enough time watching Silas to know that nothing he did was idle or accidental, that every action was considered. The mittens were considered. The bear was considered. He was telling her something with his hands because the words were not yet in a place he could reach. She carved a button onto the bear's carved jacket with a borrowed knife 2 days later, a small addition that required effort, and left it back where she'd found it. When she came back into the cabin from the morning's animal duties, the bear was in Silas's hands, and he was looking at the button she'd carved. He looked up at her. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. But the complications of living in proximity to something you are beginning to feel without knowing how to act on it are real complications. And February brought one of them in the 4th week, in the form of a disagreement that escalated faster than either of them anticipated. Started with a deer, Silas had brought it in a clean kill, a good-sized buck, which meant significant work in terms of butchering and preservation. Elowen started the process while he dealt with the animals, and she was doing it efficiently. She was certain of that. She had been doing this for months, and she knew what she was doing. And when Silas came back in and looked at the work and said, "You're cutting it wrong," something in her went sideways. "I'm cutting it the way I've been cutting it all winter," she said. "I know. I haven't said anything because we've had smaller animals, and the waste doesn't matter as much. With something this size, the way you're doing it wastes about 15% of usable meat." She looked at him. "Then show me the right way." "I am showing you." "You're telling me I'm wrong. That's different from showing me." He looked at her. Something shifted. "You're right," he said, and the concession was immediate and undefended, which took some of the steam out of what she'd been building. "Come here, I'll show you." She went. He showed her. The technique was different from what she'd been doing in a way that was genuinely more efficient, and she absorbed it with the focused attention she applied to everything she learned on this mountain, and she thought, he is not wrong. And she had not been wrong either. She'd been doing her best with what she knew. And the difference between Silas correcting her and Harlan telling her she was useless was so vast it almost required a different word. But the feeling that had flared, that hot defensive readiness, told her something about herself that she hadn't known was still there. The woman who had learned to brace for criticism as a precursor to something worse. The woman who had calibrated her own competence against Harlan's contempt and come out of that calibration's understanding herself as fundamentally insufficient. That woman was still in her somewhere, apparently. She thought about that while she worked. When the deer was dealt with and the cabin was calmer, Silas said, "Did I?" and stopped. She looked at him. "I don't know how to ask this," he said, "without asking about things that aren't my business." "Ask it. Did I say something the way—" He stopped again. He was not a man who reached for words easily, and this was clearly harder than usual. "I don't know what things sound like to you, what they land like." "I don't know thee. I don't know what you hear when someone corrects you." She set down the cloth she'd been using. She looked at him for a moment. "I heard criticism," she said carefully, "and I heard that it was valid. And there was a moment in between those two things where they weren't connected yet. And in that moment, I reacted to the first part before I could get to the second." Silas nodded slowly. "That makes sense. I'm working on it," she said. "I'm not asking you to work on it," he said. "I'm asking if I can be more careful about how I say things." She stared at him. "What?" he said. "You're asking if you can be more careful," she said. "You're not telling me to react differently. You're asking if you can adjust." "Yes, that's—" She stopped. "That's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" She looked away briefly. "I'm used to being the problem." Silas was quiet for a moment. Outside, the February wind moved through the pines. "You're not the problem," he said. "You're a person who got handed a significant amount of damage and learned to function inside it anyway." "That's different." She didn't have a response to that. Not because there wasn't one, but because finding words for what that landed like would have required more composure than she currently had access to. "Elowen," he said. She looked at him. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've watched you this winter. I've watched you figure out this mountain. The smokehouse, the animals, the—" He stopped. "You're not insufficient. You've never been insufficient. Whoever taught you that was wrong." She made herself hold his gaze. "I know that," she said. "I'm getting better at believing it." "That's enough," he said. "Believing it takes time. Knowing it is the start." That night she sat with Toby while he was falling asleep, and she looked at the small familiar details of the cabin, the rifle against the wall, the carved bear beside Toby's blankets, the mittens on the shelf, the fire that she had built because she had learned how, and she thought about the woman she had been in October, and the woman she was in February, and the distance between them that was not measured in months, but in something harder to quantify. She thought about how she had stitched a man back together in this room, with her hands shaking, and her training non-existent, and her son watching from his cot. She thought about how the rifle was hers now in a way that wasn't about Silas giving it to her, but about her earning the right to it through competence and practice and the understanding that her safety was her own responsibility. She thought about the deer, and the argument, and the conversation afterward, and the specific way Silas had looked at her when he said, "You're not insufficient." She thought about Danny, the boy who would have been 10 last August, and the way Toby reached for Silas in the mornings, and the carved bear with the button she'd added. She was in love with him. She identified it with the calm, slightly stunned clarity of someone recognizing a thing that has been present for a while, but that the conscious mind has been carefully not looking at, because looking at it directly would require doing something about it. She was in love with Silas Rourke, and she had absolutely no idea what to do with that, because the last man she had loved had sold her on an auction crate. She lay down beside Toby in the dark, and listened to the fire, and let the realization sit with her, and thought not yet. She wasn't ready yet. There were things to figure out before yet was even a question. There was the matter of who she was becoming, still in process, still not finished. There was the matter of what she wanted, which was a question she had not been allowed to have for 4 years and was still learning how to ask. There was the matter of whether she could trust what she felt, or whether she was a woman who had been in the cold long enough that she'd mistaken the first warmth she found for something it wasn't. She needed more time. The mountain was full of it. Outside, the snow fell in the particular way it fell on February nights in the high country, steady and sure and without hurry, covering everything equally, making no distinctions. Toby's breathing deepened into sleep beside her. Somewhere across the cabin, Silas shifted on his bedroll and was still. The fire held. Elowen closed her eyes and thought about spring, and what it might bring, and what she might be by the time it arrived. March arrived the way it always did at that altitude, not as a season change, but as an argument between winter and everything else, with winter refusing to concede ground it had held for months and the earth underneath pushing back with the slow, irresistible pressure of things that had been waiting long enough. The snow didn't melt so much as it surrendered in patches. First on the south-facing slope above the cabin, where the angle of the strengthening sun hit longest a strip of brown earth, appearing one morning that Elowen noticed from the doorway and stood looking at for longer than made practical sense. Just looking at actual ground, actual dirt, the confirmation that the world, beneath all that white, had been there the whole time. Toby saw it too from her hip, and reached toward it with the focused interest he applied to anything new. Not yet, she told him, it's still cold. He reached anyway. She understood the impulse. Inside the cabin, the dynamic between her and Silas had shifted in February and kept shifting in March in ways that neither of them addressed directly, because addressing them directly would have required a vocabulary neither had fully developed yet. What they had instead was proximity and its accumulating weight, the specific awareness of another person in your space that changes texture over time, that moves from strange to familiar to something that doesn't have a clean word. She was aware of him differently now. Not in ways she acted on, she was careful not to act on them, careful to keep the space between deliberate action and feeling wide enough to think in. But the awareness was there regardless of what she did with it. The way he moved through the cabin in the morning. The specific set of his shoulders when he was working through a problem. The sound of him at the door at the end of the day, not quite a knock because it was his own door, but never a sudden entrance either always, that brief pause, that small consideration, announcing himself before he came in. She had started noticing when he didn't do that, the rare days when he came in with his mind fully occupied with something else and forgot the pause. Those days, the door opened and she flinched just slightly, just the ghost of the old reflex, and then settled. And she could feel him registering what had happened even when he said nothing. The slight adjustment in how he moved through the space afterward. He never mentioned it. She never mentioned it. But it was there, the way old injuries are there present. Manageable, slowly becoming something you navigate around rather than something that stops you. On a Thursday in the second week of March, she was keeping the days now, Silas had a rough calendar marked on the wall beside the supply shelf, and she'd adopted his system. She was working on a harness repair that had been waiting since February when Silas came in from the trapline with something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not worry, not injury. Something more like the face of a man who has been thinking about something for a long time and has arrived at the edge of saying it. He sat down at the table. She kept working on the harness. He said, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask it that the answer doesn't change anything about the arrangement here." She set down the harness. "Then ask it." He looked at the table for a moment. His hands, which were never idle, were flat on the wood and still. "Are you all right?" She waited. "I don't mean are you managing," he said. "I mean the winter is long, and you came here under. You came here because there wasn't another option. And I want to know if you're all right, what that means to you specifically. Because I haven't asked, and I should have asked before now." She looked at him for a moment. "That's not a simple question," she said. "I know." She thought about how to answer it honestly. Not the performing version, not the fine that people said when they didn't want to explain themselves, not the complicated version that would require more excavation than the moment warranted. The actual honest answer. "I'm better than I've been in years," she said. "That's true, and I mean it. I'm also she stopped. "I'm still figuring out how to be a person who isn't afraid most of the time. I don't always know where the line is between being cautious and being stuck. Waiting for something to go wrong. Something went wrong," he said. Repeatedly. For years. That's not an irrational thing to be waiting for. "No," she agreed. "But I'd like to stop waiting for it." "Has anything here?" He stopped. He started again more carefully. "Have I done anything that's made it harder for you to stop waiting?" She looked at him. The question cost him something to ask. She could see that the deliberate way he held himself while he waited for the answer, the stillness that was actually a managed tension. "No," she said. "You've done the opposite, which is its own kind of adjustment." "The opposite. Being treated decently," she said. "After a long time of not being treated decently. It takes some getting used to. You keep waiting for it to turn. You keep looking for the mechanism underneath it." "And I haven't found one," she said. "I've been looking for months and there isn't one. And I'm starting to believe that." He nodded, slowly, like he was working through the full shape of what she'd said. "Good," he said finally. "Is that what you needed to know?" "Part of it. What's the other part?" He looked at his hands on the table. "I want you to know that when the spring comes and the pass is clear, there will be options. That I won't. I want you to know that you aren't trapped here. That this isn't—" He seemed to be pushing against the limits of what he could articulate, which was not like him. Silas was not a man who usually struggled for words when he had decided to speak. "I don't want you to stay here because there's nowhere else to go. I want that to be a choice, when it can be a choice." She was quiet for a moment. "And if it's already feeling like a choice," she said. He looked up. "Not because there's nowhere else," she said carefully, "but because—" She stopped. She wasn't ready to finish that sentence, not all the way, not yet. "I'm not unhappy here, Silas. That's what I'm saying. I'm not enduring this." He looked at her with an expression that was very still and very careful, the expression of a man who has heard something he wanted to hear and is checking every part of it for accuracy before he allows himself to let it matter. "All right," he said. "All right? All right." He picked the harness up off the table and held it out to her. "You missed a rivet on the left side." She stared at him. Then she took the harness. "I know I missed the rivet," she said. "I was getting to it. I thought you might want to know." "I was aware." "Good," he said. And there was that thing again in the corner of his mouth that she had decided several weeks ago was definitely a suppressed smile. And she turned back to the harness so he wouldn't see her own expression, which was doing something she wasn't quite ready to explain. Spring's slow arrival brought practical demands that pushed everything else temporarily aside. The trapping season that had sustained them through the winter needed to be wrapped up and the pelts prepared for trade. The cabin required a thorough assessment for damage sustained under months of heavy snow. The south corner of the roof had developed a sag that needed attention before the melt put weight and water stress on it simultaneously. The animals needed transitioning from winter feed to what they could begin grazing on the emerging lower slopes. Elowyn's smokehouse, which had become genuinely hers through the winter, she had a system for it now that was more efficient than what Silas had been doing needed, restocking and reorganization for the spring preservation work. There was enough to do that the conversation they'd had in March sat on a shelf, not forgotten, not resolved, just waiting. Toby had learned to crawl with genuine purpose and was applying this skill to the exploration of every corner of the cabin with the systematic thoroughness of a very small expedition team. He had also begun the process of learning to pull himself upright against furniture, which he could achieve on the good temps and which ended in faceplants on the bad ones, the outcomes he seemed to consider equally interesting. He had 2 teeth now. He had opinions about food, specifically strong opinions about certain things. Elowyn tried to feed him that he expressed with a clarity and volume that suggested he would be fine at making himself understood in life. Silas, who had spent most of the winter observing Toby from a considered distance present and attentive but not presuming had, by March, been drawn fully into Toby's orbit in the way that infants draw people in, which is through persistence and the complete lack of self-consciousness about what they want. Toby wanted Silas's attention in the mornings and communicated this by dragging himself across the floor and attaching to Silas's boot, which was where Silas reliably was at that hour, and then looking up with an expression that contained its own argument. Silas would look down at him. There would be a pause during which Silas appeared to be deciding something. Then he would pick Toby up with the matter-of-fact care of a man who had made his peace with something, and Toby would grab whatever he could reach, usually Silas's collar, occasionally his hair, and look around at the world from this higher vantage with visible satisfaction. Elowyn watched this happen over several weeks and felt the complexity of it, the tenderness of it, the sadness underneath the tenderness, the thought of Danny always somewhere in the room when Toby reached for Silas. She didn't talk about it, but she let it happen, let the space between Silas and her son close naturally rather than managing it or protecting against it. Toby didn't need protecting from Silas. That was a thing she knew now, in the deep way you know things that have been demonstrated rather than promised. April brought the trader. She heard the mule before she saw anything, the sound traveling ahead of Orson Pike, the way sound does on a quiet mountain, clear and specific, the particular cadence of a loaded animal on uncertain spring ground. She was outside checking the garden plot she'd been working on clearing when she heard it, and she stood up and looked toward the trailhead and felt something complicated move through her. Civilization, or the nearest approximation of it. Orson Pike was a man of approximately 60 who had the specific appearance of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors being rained on and had arrived at a functional peace with this. He was short, broad, with a beard that had gone past maintenance into something that had its own ongoing project, and he wore a coat that had clearly survived multiple owners and intended to survive multiple more. He rode a mule and led a second mule with supplies, and when he came into the clearing and saw Elowyn, he stopped. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man revising his expectations in real time. "Rourke about," he said. "He's on the south slope," she said. "He'll be back before dark," I can send. "No need," Pike said with the voice of a man who spent most of his time alone and found conversation simultaneously welcome and mildly exhausting. "I'll wait. Name's Orson Pike. I trade through here twice a year." "I know," she said. "I'm Elowyn. Silas told me you'd come through." Pike looked at her for another moment with eyes that were doing more work than his face was showing. "Didn't know Rourke had company up here. He does now," she said, and went back to clearing the garden plot. Pike made camp at the edge of the clearing, with the efficiency of a man who had been making camp in unfamiliar locations for decades. And by the time Silas came back down from the slope, Pike had a fire going and coffee on, and was sitting in front of it with the patience of someone who has learned that waiting is mostly just a different kind of work. Silas came into the clearing and stopped. "Pike," he said. "Rourke." Pike looked at him over the fire. "Interesting winter appears." "Got supplies?" "Everything on your list, plus some extras I thought you might want." Pike's eyes moved to where Toby was sitting in the doorway of the cabin in the last of the afternoon light, working on something that appeared to be an interesting piece of bark. "Got some things that seem even more relevant now than when I packed them." "What extras?" Pike produced a list from somewhere inside his coat and read it with the detached professionalism of a man conducting a business transaction, which was what this was. Silas listened and made occasional short responses, and the two of them fell into the rhythm of men who have done this before, the specific cadences of a long-term commercial arrangement that has its own established language. Elowen made dinner. She made more of it than usual because Pike was there, and because she had been alone with Silas and Toby for so long that feeding an additional person felt like an occasion that warranted effort. She made the venison stew she'd been improving since December, which was genuinely good now, better than good. She had a confidence in her cooking that had nothing to do with the false confidence of someone who'd never had reason to doubt themselves, and everything to do with the confidence of someone who had learned a thing fully. Pike ate it with a focused appreciation that required no words, just the quality of his attention to the bowl. "Good," he said finally. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it. I eat my own cooking for 6 months at a stretch, and I've made my peace with it, but this is actually good." Silas was looking at his own bowl. "She's been running the smokehouse since November," he said, which was not an explanation so much as information, but it landed with the slight weight of a man telling someone something he's proud of without using any of the words for pride. Pike looked between them with those busy eyes. He said nothing. After dinner, after Toby was asleep, the three of them sat by the fire, Silas on his usual chair, Pike on the section of log he'd dragged over, Elowen on the other chair with a piece of sewing she wasn't really doing, just having in her hands, and Pike reached into his pack and produced a bottle of whiskey and set it on the ground between them. "Got news from down below," he said. "If you want it." "Go ahead," Silas said. "Rattlesnake Hollow is finished," Pike said. Fire took most of the saloon district in January. Cutter's outfit moved north after that. Mine's mostly played out anyway, been coming for 2 years. He paused. The people that were left scattered south, mostly. Went to Garfield or further. Elowen listened to this with her eyes on her sewing. "Harlan Price," Silas said. "Not a question exactly." "But pointed." "Dead," Pike said. "Not cruelly, just factually with the flatness of a man delivering weather." "December, they told me down in Garfield. Gambling dispute, from what I heard. Man he owed pulled a knife, a pause, wasn't a slow death." The fire cracked. Elowen set down her sewing. She sat with that information. Harlan is dead. Harlan is dead in December. Harlan has been dead since December, and she didn't know, and she waited to feel something definitive about it and found instead a complicated nothing, a kind of emptiness where a feeling should have been. She had been afraid of Harlan for 3 years. She had hated him in the specific way that you hate someone who has convinced you, through sustained repetition, that you are less than you are. She had, in weak moments during the winter, been afraid that he would come up the mountain, somehow, that the reach of his damage wasn't yet finished. He was gone, had been gone for months. She felt not relieved exactly. Not glad, not sad. Something in between all of those things that didn't resolve into a single clean emotion, just sat there being complicated. She became aware that both Silas and Pike were not looking at her, which was its own kind of consideration. "All right," she said finally, "just to say something. Put something in the space." Pike nodded once. He poured 2 measures of whiskey and offered one to Silas, and then looked at Elowen with the bottle still in his hand. "No," she said. "Thank you." Later, after Pike had rolled out his bedroll in the barn, was a trader who had clearly stayed in enough places that he required nothing special. Elowen and Silas were alone in the cabin in the firelight, Toby a breathing shape in the sleeping area. and the news about Harlan was still in the room with them. "You knew him," she said. "Before. You'd seen him in the settlement." "I'd seen what he was in the settlement," Silas said. "For 2 years, what he did to his horses, the way he spoke to people." A pause. "I'd seen you once before that night, in the general store. You had Toby on your hip, couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, and you were asking about prices, and Harlan came in behind you and said something to you, and he stopped." He looked at the fire. "You went small, that's the only way I have to say it. You were standing in the store, and he came in, and you went small." She was quiet. "I remembered that," he said, "when I heard what he was doing that night. I remembered what you looked like in that store. You came because of a woman you saw in a store once," she said. "I came because I had the means to stop something wrong," he said, returning to what he'd said that first night, the same words. "But then, and yes, I remembered what you looked like. Both things can be true." She looked at him across the fire. He looked back at her. The space between those two chairs had been contracting for months in ways that neither of them had officially acknowledged, and in the firelight, with the news of Harlan still in the room and spring pressing against the walls outside, Elowen felt it contracting further. She was not ready to cross it yet, but she wanted to. That was different from anything she had allowed herself to want in a very long time. "He can't follow us up the mountain now," she said. "He was never going to follow you up the mountain," Silas said. There was something in his voice when he said it quiet, certain, that told her he had considered this, possibly more than once. "You would have stopped him?" "Yes." No elaboration. Just yes, flat and complete. She let out a breath she had been holding since November, or possibly longer. The next morning, Pike produced the extras he'd mentioned, which turned out to be a bolt of fabric-good wool, deep blue, clearly selected with the intention of being used rather than displayed, a set of small carved wooden animals, and a children's primer with a worn cover. He set them on the table with a studied casualness that didn't quite hide what they were, things selected for a woman and a child who Orson Pike had not, till yesterday, known were here but who had clearly, somehow, been thought of. She looked at him. "I trade through a lot of mountain camps," he said. "You notice, after a while, what people need that they don't put on their lists." He produced a small parcel separately, wrapped in oilcloth, and placed it in front of Silas. "From Garfield. It came into the store there in March. Man said it was looking for Silas Rourke of the High Country, which is you, as far as I know." Silas took the parcel and looked at the writing on it, a woman's hand, careful and old-fashioned, and something moved across his face that was private enough that Elowen looked away. He did not open it at the table. Pike left after the morning meal, which she made with the wool still on the table, and the wooden animals arranged in a row that Toby was working his way down with focused determination, testing each one for suitability as a teething object. "Come through in September," Silas said, at the trailhead. "Same as always," Pike said. He got onto his mule. He looked at Elowen, who was standing at the edge of the clearing with Toby on her hip. "Good place up here," he said to her, "cold, but good." "Yes," she said. He nodded once and turned the mule and was gone down the trail, the second mule following, the sounds of them fading into the morning. Silas stood at the trailhead for a moment after they'd gone. Then he walked back to the cabin and she walked beside him, and he went to the supply side of the cabin and picked up the oilcloth parcel and turned it in his hands. "You don't have to explain it," she said. "I know." He set it on the shelf. "My sister," he said, "in Tennessee. I wrote her in the fall with Pike. Told her I was still alive. She apparently believed this sufficiently to write back." "That's good," Elowen said carefully. "It's been 6 years since I wrote her." He said it without defending it, just placing the fact where it was. "After Martha and Danny died, I wasn't." He stopped. "I stopped writing. I stopped most things for a while. Then I came up here, and you've been here since." Yes, she thought about a woman in Tennessee waiting 6 years for a letter from her brother. She thought about her own sister, the middle one, the funny one who she hadn't written to in 4 years, and who might or might not still be where she'd last known her to be. I'd like to write my sister, she said. Papers on the supply shelf, he said. Second row. She wrote the letter that afternoon, sitting at the table with Toby asleep and Silas outside on the roof repair. She wrote 3 drafts of it, because the first 2 were either too much or not enough. And the third was something in between that felt like the truth without being the entire truth and account of where she was, and that she was safe, and that Toby was well. And that she would explain more when she could, and that she thought about her often. She did not explain November, not in this letter. Some things needed to be said in person or not at all. She sealed it and put Pike's name on the outside and set it on the shelf where it would wait until September. Then she went outside to where Silas was working on the roof and stood at the base of the ladder and looked up. The corner joint, she said, on the left side. There's a gap you're missing. He looked at where she was pointing. He looked back at her. I can see that, he said. I thought you might want to know, she said. A pause, and then from 12 feet up on a roof repair in the thin April sunlight, Silas Rourke smiled at her. Not the suppressed, almost smile she'd been cataloging all winter. An actual smile, unreserved, brief, transforming his scarred face into something entirely different and entirely itself at the same time. She kept her own expression level through an effort that deserved recognition. He turned back to the joint. She went back inside. She sat down at the table and looked at the blue wool and the wooden animals and the primer with the worn cover, and she thought about spring, about what was coming, about what had already arrived without her fully noticing. What had arrived was this: she was home, not because she had no other options, not because the mountain had worn her down to accepting wherever she'd landed, but because home, she was beginning to understand, was not a place you arrived at by default. It was a place you built with the specific materials available to you, your own capable hands, your child's laugh, the quiet presence of a man who had showed her, without theater or grand declaration, what it looked like to be genuinely respected. The problem was that building something was different from claiming it. And claiming it would require saying things she hadn't yet said to a man who had told her explicitly that he was not asking for anything. She needed to tell him that she was offering something anyway. Not but soon. The spring was opening the world again, and with the world came options, real ones. And before those options fully clarified themselves, she needed to be honest with him, with herself about what she actually wanted. She picked up the primer and opened it to the first page and looked at the printed letters and thought, Toby would need to learn these. She would teach him here, in this cabin on this mountain. In this home she had built from the materials of the worst night of her life. Outside she could hear Silas on the roof, steady and methodical, working through the repair with the patience of a man who understood that some things required time and careful attention to do correctly. She understood that now, too. Some things required time. But spring had arrived, and time was no longer something she was rationing like winter supplies, no longer something she was saving against future catastrophe. It was something she had here in the opening world, with her son learning to stand and her sister getting a letter and a roof being repaired above her head by a man who had smiled at her like that. She had time. She intended to use it. The roof was finished by the second week of April. Silas came down the ladder that last afternoon with sawdust in his hair and a cut across his palm from a tool that had slipped. And he stood in the clearing and looked up at the repair work with the expression of a man doing a final inspection, not admiring it, just confirming it was done correctly, which was the closest Silas got to satisfaction with completed work. Then he wrapped his hand in a strip of cloth he pulled from his pocket and went inside to wash it properly. Elowen was at the table feeding Toby something mashed that Toby was accepting with moderate enthusiasm. She saw the hand when he came through the door. "Let me look at that," she said. "Shallow. I know it's shallow. Let me look at it." He sat down at the table and held out his hand with the resigned expression of a man who has learned that arguing this particular point costs more than it saves. She unwrapped the cloth and examined the cut. He was right, it was shallow. A clean slice that had bled more than it had damaged, And she cleaned it and wrapped it properly with the matter-of-fact efficiency she had developed over a winter of managing injuries, both catastrophic and minor. His hand was very large in both of hers. She was aware of this in a way she did not comment on. "Done with the roof," she said, tying off the bandage. "Yes, good timing. The melt is going to accelerate this week." "I know." She let go of his hand and went back to Toby, who had used the interval to apply a significant quantity of mashed food to the carved bear sitting beside his bowl, apparently as an offering. She cleaned the bear and gave it back to him, and he put it in his mouth, which was where everything went these days. "Silas," she said. "Yes." She kept her eyes on Toby for a moment, deciding. She had been deciding since April began. She had been deciding, in some form, since February, since the night she'd put the knowledge of her own feelings on a shelf and told herself, not yet. It was May in 2 weeks, not yet had run its course. "I need to say something to you," she said, "and I need you to let me finish it before you say anything back." He said nothing, which she took as agreement. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that careful stillness she knew now, not the stillness of a man withholding himself, but the stillness of a man who is paying full attention and knows that interrupting would cost something. "When you told me last fall that you'd paid a debt and not bought a person," she said, "I believed you." "Not right away. I didn't have the capacity to believe anything right away, but eventually. And everything after that confirmed it. The floor. The rifle. The way you've been." She stopped, steadied. "You told me in March that you wanted the arrangement here to be a choice when it could be a choice. You said you didn't want me staying because there was nowhere else to go." "I remember," he said. "I'm staying because there's nowhere else I want to go," she said. "That's different. I need you to know that it's different. And I need you to know that I know the difference, because I didn't always know the difference, and I need you to understand that I do now." She held his gaze. "This isn't. I'm not confused about what this is. I'm not mistaking safety for something else. I know what safety feels like because I've had it here, and I know what the other thing feels like because I'm feeling it too, and they're not the same thing." Silas was very still. "I'm not asking you to do anything with that," she said. "I'm not asking for anything. I just needed to say it because you've been honest with me since the first night, and I owe you the same, and I've been carrying this since February, and it's heavy, and I'd like to set it down." She stopped talking. The fire made its small sound. Toby dropped the bear and looked at it on the floor with the philosophical expression of a 10-month-old confronting gravity. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his bandaged hand on the table. Then he looked back at her. "February," he said. "Yes." "I've been carrying it since December," he said. She stared at him. "The night you sat in the chair after the fever broke," he said. "And you put your face in your hands, and then you put it back together, and you checked my temperature and put a log on the fire." Something in his jaw moved. "I've been carrying it since then." She had not expected that. She had prepared herself for various responses, for careful deflection, for the responsible recitation of all the reasons this was complicated, for the considered distance of a man protecting both of them from something premature. She had not prepared herself for December. "You didn't say anything," she said. "You weren't ready," he said. "And I don't have the right to—" He stopped. His hands on the table were flat and still again, that particular stillness. "You came here because you had no other option. Anything I felt, I was not going to put that on you while you were still figuring out if you were safe. That's not how you treat someone." She thought about that. About a man who had been carrying something since December and had said nothing because he was waiting for her to be ready. About the discipline that required, the specific kind of care that would hold something that long without letting it press on the person it was about. "That's not how you treat someone," she repeated. "No. You realize how different that is," she said, "from what I knew before." "I know what you knew before," he said quietly. "No," she said. "I don't think you fully do, because to you this is just being decent. This is just the basic way things should work. You don't see it as anything remarkable because you've never operated any other way." She shook her head slightly. "It is remarkable. What you've done this winter is remarkable. Not because the bar is low, but because it is actually. She stopped. Words were insufficient. She had been finding words insufficient for weeks. Elowen, he said. I know, she said. I know. They looked at each other across the table that she had eaten at every morning for 6 months. In the cabin, where she had learned to smoke meat and fire a rifle and stitch wounds and render fat and keep a household running in conditions that would have broken the woman she used to be. Toby made a sound at the floor, and both of them looked at him. He had pulled himself upright against the table leg and was standing, genuinely standing, more steadily than he'd managed before, with an expression of concentrated triumph. It was the first time he'd done it without falling immediately. Silas was off the chair in the same moment Elowen moved, both of them arriving at Toby's level simultaneously. And Toby looked between them with the enormous pleased satisfaction of a person who has achieved something in front of exactly the right audience, and then sat down again very suddenly because his legs had made a unilateral decision. Elowen laughed. Silas caught Toby before his head met the floor, one hand coming under him with the reflexive speed that Elowen had stopped being surprised by weeks ago, and set him upright again gently. And Toby grabbed Silas's finger with both hands and held on. They were both on the floor, she and Silas, kneeling beside her son, and they were close enough that she could have reached out without stretching and touched his face. And she didn't do that, not yet. Not quite, but she looked at him. His scarred profile bent toward Toby, and she thought, this is it. This is the thing I get to choose. He's going to be walking by summer, Silas said. God help us, she said, and then caught herself and changed it to, Lord help us, then stopped entirely. Because she didn't use those phrases, and the nervous energy of the moment was scrambling her. She simply said, we're going to have to move everything up 6 inches. Silas looked at her, the suppressed smile, the real one. Both present at once somehow. Yes, he said, we are. She said, we. He understood what she was doing with the word. She could see him understand it. We, he confirmed. Simply, like a door opening, she put her hand on his arm. Not taking hold of it, not grasping, just placing her hand there, on the sleeve of his shirt, the contact light and deliberate. He looked at her hand and then at her face, and she held his gaze and didn't remove the hand. And after a moment he put his own hand over hers, big, warm, the bandaged palm wrapping around her fingers, with a carefulness she recognized from the way he handled everything he considered worth protecting. They stayed like that on the cabin floor with Toby between them working on standing again. There was nothing cinematic about it. Her knees were getting sore. Toby immediately grabbed Silas's bandaged hand and tried to eat it. Silas made a short sound that was half protest, half something else entirely, and extracted his hand with the gentle efficiency of months of practice with Toby's particular brand of determined affection. It was not a perfect moment. It was better than perfect. It was real. May arrived, and with it a warmth that had weight to it, actual warmth, the kind that came from the sun being higher in the sky rather than just the absence of cold. The snow retreated in earnest, revealing the mountain in layers, the landscape reassembling itself from white abstraction into specific and particular terrain, this rock, this tree root, this path along this slope that was passable in summer and not in winter. Elowen walked it all. She had spent the winter confined mostly to the cabin and the immediate work areas, and May let her range, let her learn the shape of the mountain she had been living on without fully seeing. Took Toby on her back. He was solid now. Substantial. A weight she managed the way she managed everything on this mountain, through the development of capacity she hadn't known she had, and she walked. She walked the trap line with Silas on the days he was checking it, learning the routes and the logic of them, the way you placed a trap in relation to the signs of passage and the natural funneling of terrain. She walked the perimeter of the homestead on other days, mapping it in her own mind, assigning her own sense of ownership to it through familiarity rather than legal right. She walked the North Ridge once, without telling Silas, to see the place where the mountain lion had taken him. She stood at the edge of the rocky outcrop that looked down into the ravine, and she looked at the terrain, the blind angle coming around the boulder, the natural ambush geometry of it, and she thought about that morning in December when Silas had come through the door. And she thought about who she had been at that moment and what she had done, and she stood on that ridge with the rifle across her shoulder and felt the full weight of that. She had saved his life, not as a debt, not as an obligation, not as the performance of gratitude for a man who had rescued her. She had saved his life because he mattered to her, and she had the capacity to save him, and she had used it. That was a different kind of thing. That was agency, clean and complete, belonging entirely to her. She turned and walked back down the slope. When she came into the clearing, Silas was at the woodpile. He looked up and saw her coming down from the North Ridge direction and looked at the rifle on her shoulder and said nothing. "I wanted to see it," she said when she reached him. "I know," he said. "You knew where I went. I can read tracks," he said. "You've been reading them for 4 months. Did you think I wouldn't notice the direction?" She looked at him. "Were you worried?" A pause. "Yes," he said. "I was fine. I can see that." He went back to splitting wood. Then, without looking up, "Did you get what you needed from it?" She thought about that. "Yes," she said. He nodded once and split another log. She watched him for a moment. This man splitting wood in the May sunlight, with his winter scars and his quiet and his consistent, undemonstrative presence. And she thought, "I would like to say something true to him every day for the rest of my life, and I think he would do the same for me, and I think that is enough. More than enough. That is the thing people are actually looking for when they use bigger words." She went inside and put Toby down for his afternoon sleep and started dinner. The conversation happened a week later, in the evening, when the light was doing what May light does at altitude going, long and golden and reluctant, holding at the horizon past the time it should, the world suspended in that particular last clarity before dark. They were sitting outside, which had become possible, and then habitual with the warming, 2 chairs carried out to where the clearing faced west. Toby was asleep inside. The air smelled of pine and wet earth and the specific cleanness of a mountain evening in the growing season. Silas said, "I want to say something, and I need to say it carefully." She waited. "I'm aware of what I am," he said, "and what this place is. I'm a man living alone on a mountain, who the nearest settlement regarded as they told stories about me down there. I know the stories." He looked at his hands. I'm not an easy thing to have chosen. There are parts of the past 8 years that are," he stopped. "I'm not the simplest option. I didn't know you were presenting options," she said. "Elowen, I'm serious," she said. "I'm not choosing between options. I'm telling you what I want. Those are different things. I want to make sure you've thought about what it means," he said. "This mountain, this isolation, the winters. What Pike said about there being other places, He stopped. "You're 23 years old. You have a child who will need things I don't know how to give him. Schooling other children. A community. I'm teaching him," she said. "He'll be able to read before he's 5, and the mountain isn't forever. It doesn't have to be forever, but right now this is where I want to be, and the reason I want to be here is not only the mountain." She looked at him directly. "You know that, I know that," he said quietly. "Then what are you actually asking?" He was quiet for a long moment. The evening light moved across the clearing, and somewhere below them a bird made its evening sound, and Toby's murmur came briefly from inside the cabin and settled. "I'm asking if you're certain," he said. "Not because I doubt you. He stopped. Something in his jaw moved. "Because the last time I let myself, the last time there was someone he couldn't finish it. He didn't need to. She knew the end of that sentence. She knew who finished it. Martha. Danny. The farming country in Tennessee and a life that ended, and a man who came up a mountain and didn't come back down for 8 years. She understood then the full shape of what she was asking him to let happen. It wasn't just her trust being rebuilt, it was his too. He had sealed himself up here not just from people, but from the specific vulnerability of having people to lose. He had built a life that was survivable precisely because nothing in it could be taken from him by the cruelty of chance. And then he had gone down a mountain on a November night and spent $120 and come back up with a woman and a baby, and somewhere in the months since had found himself back in the territory he had left. Territory of people who mattered. That was terrifying. She knew exactly how terrifying it was, because she had been in it too. She had felt the specific fear of beginning to rely on something good, the constant waiting for it to reveal itself as temporary or conditional or false. She reached over and put her hand on his arm, the same gesture as the floor of the cabin weeks ago, light and deliberate. "I know what you lost," she said, "and I can't promise you that losing things isn't possible. I can't promise you that nothing bad will happen because bad things happen and we both know it better than most people. What I can tell you is that I'm not leaving. That's not a feeling. It's a decision, and I've made it with everything I know about decisions and what they cost and what they mean." She paused. "I'm not asking you to stop being afraid. I'm asking you to be afraid and do this anyway. Because I think it's worth it, and I think you think it's worth it too." Silas looked at her hand on his arm. He turned his arm over and took her hand properly, the way he'd done on the cabin floor, wrapping it in both of his. "I think it's worth it," he said, not a declaration. Not theater, just the flat, certain truth of a man who had located something he believed and said it. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. They sat in the evening light, holding hands like two people who had arrived at something through a very long and difficult route and were content to be there without making a production of it. Then Silas said, "Toby needs a name." She looked at him. "He has a name. He has your name. Price." He looked at her steadily. "I wasn't suggesting that should stay." She understood what he was saying. The full weight of it arrived slowly, and she let it arrive, let herself feel the complete shape of what was being offered. Not the ownership of it, not Toby becoming a thing that transferred between men like the property in Harlan's ledgers. The opposite of that, a name as belonging, as chosen family, as the record of a deliberate thing. "That's not a small thing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't. I'm not saying it to. It's not a gesture. I mean it the way I mean everything." He paused. "That boy has been crawling after me and chewing on my furniture for 5 months, and his voice went slightly rough, and he stopped and started again. I would like him to have my name, if you're willing. If that's, I know it's something to think about." She thought about a boy named Daniel Rourke, who would have been 10 last August. She thought about Toby on Silas's chest on the mountain, in the dark, warm inside a coat that wasn't his mother's. She thought about a carved bear with a button she had added, and mittens on tiny hands, and a man on a cabin floor catching a baby before his head met the ground without thinking, just catching. "Tobias Rourke," she said quietly, hearing how it sounded. Silas was very still. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." Something happened in his face that she had never seen before. Not the suppressed smile, not the careful guardedness, not the flat practicality, something that was none of those things. Something underneath all of them that had been there the whole time and was only now visible. It lasted about 3 seconds, and then he looked away. At the tree line, and she looked away too, because some things were too unguarded to witness directly and still be decent about it. After a moment he said, "There's something else. There's always something else with you," she said. "I have money," he said, "more than I've told you about. The gold I use for trading is what I show. There's more that I've saved. 8 years of trapping with no dependents and nothing to spend on except supply runs adds up to more than you'd expect." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I want you to know that you have options even inside this choice," he said. "Whatever you want to build here, we can build it. If you want to expand the cabin, do it. If you want to build something for travelers, people do get caught on this route in the bad weather. I've thought about it. We have the space. We have the means." He paused. "I've been living like a man with nothing to build toward. I'd like to stop doing that." She thought about what he was describing. Something larger than a cabin, something with purpose beyond one man's survival. place in the mountain that people could find when the weather closed in, that offered what she had found here: warmth and safety in no conditions. You want to build something that helps people, she said. I want to build something worth building, he said. With someone worth building it with. She looked at the clearing, the homestead, the shape of the mountain above them. She thought about what this land could hold: a larger structure, a barn with real capacity, a smokehouse that could process enough to provision travelers. Her knowledge of wilderness medicine, which was not insignificant now, she treated Silas's lion wounds. She had managed a fever that should have killed him. She had delivered 2 of her neighbor's babies back in the farming country and had not been given credit for knowing what she was doing, but had known it. There were things she could offer people caught on this mountain that went beyond hot food and a dry room. We'd need help building, she said, more than the 2 of us. Pike knows people, Silas said. There are men who come through in summer looking for work. I've turned them away before. Don't turn them away this summer. He looked at her. No, she said, put them to work. The thing she saw in his face then was something she would remember for the rest of her life, not because it was dramatic, but because it was the opposite. A man who had been alone for 8 years looking at the future and recognizing it as something he was allowed to want. All right, he said. Summer came in fully by June. Building started in July when Silas had hired 2 men from a work party Pike directed. There was one, a carpenter named Voss, who was taciturn and exact and the best framer either of them had ever seen, and one a younger man called Wren, who was quick and eager and made Toby laugh by making faces at him, which Toby appreciated as high art. The addition went up on the east side of the cabin 2 rooms, one for travelers and one that could serve as storage or additional sleeping depending on need, with a proper door that latched from the inside and a small hearth of its own that Silas built with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything structural. Elowen oversaw the smokehouse expansion, which she had drawn plans for on paper over the winter, in the abstract way of someone who didn't know yet if planning was allowed, and the plans turned out to be largely correct. Voss looked at her drawings on the second day and said, "Who drew these?" "I did," she said. He looked at her. "You've built a smokehouse before." "I learned one," she said. "Over a winter." He handed the drawings back. "These are right," he said, which, coming from Voss, Silas told her later, was equivalent to anyone else saying they were exceptional. Silas told her this with the specificity of a man sharing something that pleased him without directly saying it pleased him. She had learned to read that. She had learned a great many things. Toby started walking in August. Not tentatively. He had been tentative about it for weeks and had apparently decided he was done with tentative, because one morning he stood up from the middle of the floor and walked directly across it with the expression of someone who has been waiting to do this for a long time and finds it less difficult than the preparation suggested. He reached the far wall, turned around, looked at the room, and said something that was not quite a word, but had the confidence of one. Silas, who was eating breakfast, watched this happen. He said, Elowen said, "That's all you have." "He's been working up to it for a month," Silas said. "It's not a surprise." "It's a surprise to him," she said. Silas looked at Toby, who had turned and was walking back across the room with increasing confidence, adjusting to the new information of balance the way children do, rapidly and completely. "Come here," Silas said. Toby walked to him. Silas picked him up and held him at arm's length and looked at him with that expression she had learned to read too, the one underneath the flat surface, the one that was about Danny and about this boy and about the distance between grief and love and how sometimes they occupied the same space and you had to learn to hold them both. Walking, Silas said to him. Toby said his not quite word again with emphasis. Silas settled him against his chest and held him there and looked at Elowen over his head, and she looked back at him, and nothing needed to be said, because everything was already said, was said constantly in the accumulated language of this life they were building together. Pike came through in September with supplies and mail. There was a letter from Elowen's sister. She sat on the front step of the cabin. The expanded cabin, the one that was becoming something more than a single man's shelter, and she read the letter twice. Her sister was in Oregon, had been for 2 years, was married with a small farm, had a son who was 2 years old. The letter was warm and wondering and full of questions and ended with, "Please write back. Please just keep writing back. I thought about you every winter." She thought about you every winter. Elowen held the letter and looked at the September mountain, and thought about every winter she had not written, and she forgave herself for it with the deliberateness of a choice, because there were things that could only be understood from the inside, and surviving Harlan Price was one of them, and she had survived it, and was here, and her sister was in Oregon, with a son and a small farm, and wanted letters. She would write letters. There was also in Pike's pack something he produced with the care of a man handling something that had traveled far. A small parcel from Tennessee. Silas took it, and Elowen watched his face and saw him recognize the hand on the wrapping and hold very still for a moment. He opened it at the table that evening. Inside was a letter from his sister, which he read in silence, and a small thing wrapped in additional cloth. When he unwrapped it, it was a photograph. A family photograph, old and somewhat worn at the edges, of a couple and a small child who was maybe 2 years old, laughing at something outside the frame of the image. Silas looked at it for a long time. Elowen got up and went to stand beside him and looked at the photograph with him. The small laughing boy had Silas's eyes. She put her hand on his shoulder, put his hand over hers. They stood like that for a while in the September evening, with the photograph on the table and the rebuilt cabin around them, and Toby making purposeful walking sounds somewhere in the addition, and the mountain solid outside every window. Grief and love, occupying the same space. You learn to hold them both. Later that night, after Toby was asleep, Silas said, "My sister wants to visit." In the spring, Elowen looked up from the letter she was writing to her own sister. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I'd ask you." She thought about that. A woman from Tennessee, Silas's sister, arriving on this mountain. An arrival of the past into the present, the awkwardness and difficulty and necessity of that. "Tell her yes," Elowen said. "Tell her she should come." Silas wrote the letter the following morning, which was the first letter to his sister in 8 years, and which took him 3 attempts before he was satisfied, a process Elowen did not comment on, because she understood it exactly. October arrived. It had been 1 year since the night in Rattlesnake Hollow. 1 year since the crate, the auction, the $120 placed at Harlan's feet. 1 year since she had walked into the dark with her son and a stranger. She did not mark the anniversary out loud. She marked it privately, the way you mark things that are too large and too complicated to celebrate exactly, but that you need to acknowledge to yourself as real. 1 year. She went out in the early morning while Silas was tending the animals and Toby was still asleep, and she walked to the edge of the clearing and looked at the mountain above and below her. At the homestead she had helped build from a single man's wilderness shelter into something with rooms and purpose, and the beginning of a reputation travelers had stopped here twice in August. Both times with the relieved expressions of people who had not expected to find what they found, and both times Elowen had given them food and a room and matter-of-fact, competent attention to whatever they needed. And both times they had left with the particular gratitude of people who have been helped without conditions. This was the thing she was building, not just a home, not just a life with a man she loved. A place that was the opposite of everything Rattlesnake Hollow had been, a place where people were not resources to be traded, but simply people who needed what all people need, warmth, food, safety, to be treated as though they mattered. She thought about what she had believed the night of the crate. She had believed that survival meant enduring, that being alive was the achievement, and what happened to you while alive was the variable you had no control over. She had believed that because she had been taught it through 3 years of evidence, the slow, grinding pedagogy of being told, repeatedly and in various ways, that she was powerless, and that powerlessness was her nature. She did not believe that anymore. She knew exactly when she had stopped believing it. Not in a single moment, not the rifle, Not the stitching, not the deer argument, not the hand on the arm in the cabin. In all of them, in the accumulation of a winter's worth of evidence that contradicted everything she'd been taught about herself, delivered by a mountain and a man and her own stubborn, persistent refusal to disappear. She heard Silas come out of the barn and cross the clearing toward her. He stood beside her and looked at where she was looking, which was the mountain and the morning light on it. 1 year, she said. Yes, he said. I keep thinking about who I was on that crate, she said, and trying to recognize her. And I can find her. I remember exactly how everything felt, but she seems very far away. She's not far away, Silas said. She's who got you here. She looked at him. That woman on the crate, he said. She didn't give up. She didn't go numb. She walked up a mountain in the dark, carrying a baby to a stranger's cabin, because the alternative was worse, and she kept her knife in her boot the whole time. He paused. I knew that night she wasn't going to disappear. I didn't know what else yet. But I knew that. She thought about the knife in her boot. The small folding knife she had kept there every day since Rattlesnake Hollow, a habit she had never explained to Silas and never needed to, because he was a man who understood the logic of keeping options available. She reached into her boot now, the same boot, a different morning, and took it out and looked at it. Small, ordinary, the blade worn slightly from years of incidental use. She had never needed to use it against anyone. She had hoped, standing on that crate, that she would have the courage to use it if she needed to. She had not needed to. What she had needed instead had turned out to be harder and more complicated and far more valuable, the willingness to let someone help her, to learn from a position of not knowing, to acknowledge damage without being defined by it, to receive care without immediately calculating the cost. She folded the knife and held it for a moment, then she handed it to Silas. He looked at it, then at her. Keep it somewhere, she said. Somewhere Toby can have it when he's old enough, not because he'll need it for the reason I kept it. I hope he won't need it for that reason. But because she stopped, because I want him to know it was his mother's. I want him to know that his mother kept this in her boot on the worst night of her life and walked through the dark anyway. Silas took the knife and held it in his palm with the same care he held everything worth holding. He'll know, he said. She believed him. There was one more thing that needed to happen, and it happened on a Saturday afternoon in October when the air had that edge that said winter was not far behind it, but was not yet here. When the leaves on the few deciduous trees on the lower slope had gone yellow and were letting go, and when Voss, who had stayed through the building season and was still here in that way, some people stay when a place agrees with them, happened to be around as what passed for a witness. Silas had been specific about wanting it done properly. Not an announcement, not theater. An actual minister would have required someone riding down the mountain and back and waiting, and all of that was not what either of them wanted. What they had instead was Silas, who had written ahead to the land office in the valley, and a document that had come back with Pike in September, and Voss, who could write his name legibly and had been told the plan and had said, without elaboration, fine. She wore the blue wool Pike had brought in April, made up now into an actual dress she had sewn it herself over the summer, badly in places and well in others. And she wore it because she had made it, and because blue suited her, and because it was the only thing she owned that hadn't come from either a life she was done with or the utilitarian necessities of mountain living. Silas wore a clean shirt and had done something to his hair that suggested effort without achieving anything that could be called tidy, which was exactly right. Toby wore the mittens because he had found them that morning and had opinions about wearing them regardless of the temperature. They stood in the clearing in the October afternoon with Voss as witness and said the words that the document required, and then they said other words, not the document's words, their own, that had nothing formal about them, but that were more binding than any document because they came from the specific knowledge of who the other person was. Not the best version, the actual version. The version that got afraid, that made mistakes, that sometimes came in from the cold, still carrying the cold inside them, That was imperfectly and incompletely human in all the ways that people are human when nobody is performing. Silas said, I will be honest with you every day I have the means to. And when I have trouble saying things, I will not let the trouble become an excuse. And I will be a father to your son in every way I know how to be a father. Elohim said, I will trust you with the places in me that are still learning what trust means. I won't make you prove yourself forever, and I will be a partner to you the way I've been learning to be a partner all winter. Not perfectly, but completely. Toby said something emphatic and probably related to the mittens. Voss signed the document with his precise carpenter's hand and said, Done, and went back to whatever he'd been doing, because Voss was Voss. Silas looked at her. She looked at him. Elohim Rourke, he said. Quietly, trying out the sound of it. That's going to take some getting used to, she said. We have time, he said. They did. They had time and a mountain and a cabin that was becoming something larger, and a child who was walking now, walking toward everything with the confident fearlessness of someone who had never been taught that he might not be allowed, who had grown up watching his mother shoot and his father build, and both of them choose each other out of everything available with the deliberateness of people who understood what choice actually cost. Toby Rourke grew up knowing who he was. He grew up knowing the mountain in all its seasons, knowing how to read weather and track animals, and tend a smokehouse and treat a wound. He grew up knowing that the homestead where he lived was a place people came to when they were lost or hurt or caught in the wrong weather, and that his mother would know what to do with whatever they brought to the door, and his father would know what to do with everything outside of it. He grew up knowing about the knife in the carved box on the high shelf. His mother had told him when he was 7 the story of where it came from and why she had kept it and why she had put it away. He asked questions she answered honestly, in the way she tried to answer everything honestly, which meant some of it was hard and some of it was complicated and none of it was simple. Were you scared? He asked her once. He was 8. He was asking about the crate, about the night she had walked up the mountain. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. Yes, she said, I was scared the whole time. But you went anyway. I didn't have a choice about going, she said. I had a choice about what I did when I got there. He thought about that with the focused seriousness of an 8-year-old who is not yet old enough to know that most adults don't really think about things this carefully. Did you know it would be okay? He said. No, she said. I didn't know anything. I just kept going forward because that was all I could do. He accepted that with a nod that was very like his father's. Elohim looked at her son and thought about what she wanted him to carry out of this mountain childhood, what she hoped would stay with him after everything else, after the specific warmth of the cabin and the smell of the smokehouse and the sound of his father's voice naming things in the winter dark. She wanted him to know that people did not earn kindness, that it was not a transaction with conditions, that the capacity to help someone who needed help was not diminished by using it. She wanted him to know that trust, once broken, did not recover automatically, that it came back slowly and demanded evidence, and that this was not weakness but sense. She wanted him to know that the people who told you that you were small were usually the ones most afraid of how large you might become. She wanted him to know, above everything else, that freedom was not the absence of constraints. She had been constrained every moment of her life on this mountain by weather, by work, by the realities of what survival required. Freedom was something else. Freedom was the morning she had walked to the North Ridge with the rifle on her shoulder and come back having seen what she needed to see. Freedom was the afternoon she had pushed the knife into Silas's hand and said, "Keep it." Freedom was every moment she had chosen her life here rather than simply inhabited it. She was 41 years old when she understood. She had been trying to articulate this to herself since she was 23. It was not escape that had saved her. Escape was what you called it when you had no other word. What had saved her was the discovery that she was already the person she needed to be. She had simply needed the conditions in which to find that out. The mountain had been those conditions. The man had been those conditions. And she had been those conditions too stubborn, frightened, imperfect, grieving, capable, determined, wrong about things and right about others, and unwilling to disappear. That was enough. That, it turned out, had always been enough. The homestead sat in the mountain through all its seasons for the rest of their lives, visited by travelers, who became regular visitors, who became something closer to community, tended by two people who understood each other with the specific fluency of people who had arrived at understanding through work rather than luck, and watched over by a mountain that kept its own counsel and offered, to those willing to learn its terms, something that the valley settlements with their noise and commerce never quite managed. Quiet, and the space to become who you were going to be. And in the mornings, in all seasons, the first sound was the fire. And the second sound was Toby. And the third sound was two people living the life they had chosen, imperfectly and completely, which is the only way any life worth living gets lived.